Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome once again for the second day of the National Security Symposium. I want to take this opportunity, first of all, to recognize in our presence His Excellency Mahamat Moussa Faki, the chairperson of the African Union, a special guest and a panelist of the first session today. Welcome, sir. I also want to recognize honorable ministers present who are not with us yesterday. You're welcome. We have a long morning this morning from 9 to 1300 hours in the afternoon. So we will break for a tea break at 10:30 for 30 minutes and then return at 11 for the rest of the session. So the moderator will engage the panelists from 9 to 10:30 and then break off for tea and then have the Q&A session after the tea break. So let's keep time. Thank you very much. So this morning, I have the honor of inviting our first moderator, Mr. Joseph Warungu, who is a media consultant and a communication consultant. He has worked for over 30 years in the field of journalism. He was the head of the BBC Africa News and Current Affairs Department and a former Knight International Journalism Fellow who is widely traveled in Africa, working as a journalist, trainer, and moderator of public debates on radio and TV. Warungu specializes in media management training and enhances the capacity of media to tell in-depth and compelling stories on the development issues such as health, education, business, and technology. He also runs Top Story, a national mentorship program for young journalists in Kenya in partnership with 25 universities. Warungu has a master's in media management from the University of Leeds, United Kingdom. Mr. Joseph Warungu, the media and communication consultant. Karibu sana. And by the way, he's a very good friend of RDF Command and Staff College. He has been with us for 8 years for this National Security Symposium. So you're very welcome, sir.
Our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed, good morning and welcome to this, our first session today. I can promise you to be an exciting one. It's a very hot topic and we've got a very able and experienced panel. Yesterday, we had some very riveting discussions. I enjoyed all of them, particularly touched by the one on migration, because I am in that class of people who brain drained away from Kenya to the UK and spent more than 20 years there. But I also made that conscious decision in 2011 to come back home and share that which I had picked up out there. So I set up a production company, training, and so on, to bring back those skills home. So I enjoyed that discussion very much. And thank you very much, Deputy Commandant, for tolerating me for those 8 years. It's certainly been a pleasure to come here. I feel always very much at home from whichever part of the world I'm in, always happy to be here at about this time of the year. So I'm going to invite my panel now to join me here on stage. for this discussion. If I can start with His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat, who is the African Union Commission chairperson, who is a constitutional lawyer by profession, as it says on our program, who has occupied senior government positions in a career that has spanned over 30 years, including tenure as foreign minister and also prime minister in Chad, where he comes from. So, Your Excellency, if I can invite you to join us here. And I must particularly thank you, sir, because I know you're in the midst of dealing with some very hot issues with our neighbor Sudan, but you still made time to come in. So thank you very much indeed for your time. Welcome. And then, if I can come back home, I would like to invite Honorable Vincent Biruta, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in the Republic of Rwanda. Thank you, sir. And as we might know, he's a medical doctor by training, and has served in various other capacities as minister in the Republic of Rwanda, including Minister for Environment, and he's also held other cabinet positions in the Republic right up to this moment. So it's a real pleasure to have you, sir. Now, given the nature of the discussion today, these two distinguished gentlemen are really going to be on the not the firing line, but really they're serving at that extreme end of diplomacy, and our topic really goes into that. So they have the very live experience that we want to draw from them. And then if I can cross over to the Republic of Kenya and look for Professor PLO Lumumba, who is a good friend. I haven't met him in a long time. Prof, if you can come in. He is the founder of the PLO Lumumba Foundation. Prof holds honorary doctorate degrees from the University of Cape Coast in Ghana, Bells University in Nigeria. He is an advocate of the High Courts of Kenya and Tanganyika and a certified mediator. He's a fellow of the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya, a fellow of the Kenya Institute of Management, and honorary fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. His voice and his face and his speeches are very well familiar to a lot of us throughout the African continent. So, Prof, welcome. And then if I can go to SADC region now to look for my other guest, Mr. Brian Tamuka Kagoro, please come over. Brian is a Pan-Africanist, a lawyer, entrepreneur, who's very, very passionate about this whole theme of Pan-Africanism, and again, will draw from his experiences in the various sectors that he's also been involved in. He served in various national, regional, and global leadership positions across a wide range of organizations in the private sector, the United Nations, and global philanthropy. The roles include Open Society Foundation's Global Director of Justice, an appointment by the UK Schools of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and so he has quite a few things that we'll be drawing from. So once more, a warm welcome to the panel. They will do they will do all the difficult work. Mine is just to steer the conversation and to firefight as necessary. So I will sit so that we can get the discussion going. So just to explain how we will structure this discussion, it's a wide topic. There's a lot to discuss. So I'll allow, for starters, each of our panelists to lay their case for about 3 to 5 minutes, just the initial thoughts. And then I will come in for cross-examination to test the facts and to cover any gaps. And then we'll explore the discussion in depth. And then we'll also have an opportunity, pretty much maybe after the tea break, where we can exclusively now engage with your own questions and, and other issues that you may raise. I like starting with a little random stories before we get into the discussion. Many decades ago, a story is told around Africa of this visitor who came from the Western sphere across the shores and entered the continent of Africa, armed with only one thing, a Bible in his hand. And he walked and was welcomed. Don't know that he was welcomed warmly, but he made himself welcome with his Bible. The story goes on to say that as he settled with his Bible, bringing in the word from those far destinations, it reached a point where he asked the African population, can we now pray? Can we close our eyes and say a prayer? And everybody closed their eyes. And the prayer went on. By the time they finished praying and their eyes were opened, there was a strategic transfer that happened. The Bible was now in the hands of the Africans, and the land that they were sitting on, they had occupied for generations, was now in the hands of this visitor who had come in. This is a story that is told in many spheres about how then we were left holding and very enthusiastic. I'm a Christian, so I still believe in that Bible. But it was a transaction that really, there was a complete transfer that happened at that stage. And I think those positions have continued to be up to today. To an extent, we find ourselves as Africans holding things and wondering, what are we doing with this? And the more relevant, important, strategic things that we had have crossed over into the hands of the other party. So when I was reflecting on this topic today, I had some questions that I would like to float, just initial thoughts that came to mind. And the first one is, what do we mean by foreign interference? So I'm hoping the panel will help us to understand that. And why does this issue matter so much that we're spending 3 hours and all of our time here focusing on it? Why is it so relevant to our circumstances today? And then we also want to look at what's the changing nature of this interference today. What channels are used for this interference? How have we, as an African continent, dealt with this interference? To what extent are we complicit in this interference, whether knowingly or unknowingly? I was also asking myself, how as a continent do we actually tackle this foreign interference? Now, in his book, the late Nigerian author Chinua Achebe, the book Arrow of God, reminded us of this powerful African proverb, which says that when a handshake goes beyond the elbow, it becomes something else. So as a continent, how do we tackle and stop the handshake that has gone past the elbow? That's what I'm hoping that we can tease out alongside other comments. I'm also hoping that the panel will also help us explore. We ask ourselves questions. What happens when, for example, the sexual orientation of our people becomes a tool of international diplomacy, that unless you do this, pass this, then we shall not? Or when we, as a continent, are forced to take up positions in some of these battles that have got sometimes nothing to do with us. Are you with Ukraine or are you with Russia? And why are we in this position ourselves, and how do we get out of it? That, in a nutshell, is what I'm hoping and we'll be able to explore. I'd like to kick off with Brian, if I may, just because you wear that hat of Pan-Africanism. So I'd like to welcome you to just share your initial thoughts, and then we can move on.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Excellencies. I'm always grateful to come back home to Rwanda. We do not, and we have not controlled our mining sector. We do not, and we have not controlled our data and statistics. We do not, and have not controlled our education. We do not, and have not controlled our security, whether it's digital security or it's generic continental security, whether the threats are exogenous or indigenous. We do not and have not controlled our communication channels. This is something that's been realized since the inception of the African Union. And if you think about this, as we talk about unconstitutional changes of government and other things, there are several things that are important as we reflect on foreign interference. State and nation building, how we transitioned to independence, and the Cold War and how it played out, the use of mercenaries, military coups, and capture and retention of power, and etc. In statistical terms, Chairperson, there were 200 coups in Africa between 1965 and 2012. In the 1960s, there was at least one coup every 60 days. In the 1970s, barely 18 years after Ghana's independence, at least 85% of African states had some coup experience or the other. And West Africa accounted for almost 44% of those. I mean the coups between 1958 and 2008. There was a temporary reprieve in the period post-1990. Some academics have suggested this because Africa had become more democratic. I want to disabuse you of that notion because it's lazy intellectualism. What had changed was that Western interest in a unipolar world, in changing regimes, had dissipated. The West no longer needed to use force. There was no competitor, either ideological or otherwise. What had essentially happened, there was dominance of one set of interests. So as we reflect on unconstitutional change of government, it's not just mere tinkering at the local level, but it's also what explains the ouster of Nkrumah, the assassination of Lumumba, the assassination of Sankara, the assassination of Amilcar Cabral, the assassination of Samora Machel, the ouster of Sekou Touré. What is the fact? That in a unipolar world, the appetite to change had dissipated. As we see greater polarization between the West, the East, and the Middle, we're going to see once again an intensification of interference. Less than 15% of that interference, Chair, will be justified as follows: protecting and promoting human rights or preventing genocide, protecting lives and property of citizens, fighting terrorism, violent extremism, or stopping some form of unproductive ideology. However, what we know, no intervention happens except it is in the interest and the propagation of the political, economic, social, cultural, racial, and other strategic interests of those who have power. But there are direct consequences, and have been for Africa, which are chaos and instability, retarded development, internationalization of conflicts, regional instability, destruction of cultural and other heritage, as we saw in Timbuktu, destruction of state institutions and public services, warlordism and violent extremism, as we've seen in the Horn and in the Sahel, collapse of the formal economy, and debt, poverty, and inequality, sexual and gender-based violence, and the pillage of our economies. Now, if we imagine in this framing that these are what we're dealing with, what are those channels of transmission? I want to suggest to you, Chair, that the first transmission of interference is an incompetent, corrupt, and ideologically unclear leadership. The second is a structure in the bureaucracy of government and administration that is beholden to the white gaze or to external gaze. Within the public administration, you harvest intelligence and you harvest division. The third is religion, as you rightly said. Religion, and it's not just Christianity. We have seen the competition for different sects of Islam in the Horn, in the Mediterranean. And it's not just religion, it's NGOs, international and national. Not just those, but churches as well. And I'm talking about these as institutions. But ultimately, Steve Biko described the vector of interference. He says the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. If you do not control what you educate, if you do not control what you communicate, if you do not control your narrative, you develop what we've seen, a disconnect between the leadership and the citizenry, a disconnect between the old and the young, a disconnect between the analog generation that has power and the virtual generation that is unemployed. A disconnect that is easy to employ. The future of this intervention, Chair, data and the digital platforms will define the most potent weapon in interference. You do not need to do it physically, it will be done remotely. And lastly, Chair, I want to suggest to you, the second most potent is economic fragility. A people that cannot feed themselves, that depend on foreigners to feed them, will become slaves, either willingly or by force, until this continent assures its stomach infrastructure by its ability to feed itself, until this continent assures its mental infrastructure by the ability to think for itself and ideate. Then this continent will be thought for by others, fed by others. There's no liberty without these liberated intellectual zones and the ability to feed yourself. So interference happens because of our own inferiority and because of the supremacist views of others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Brian. Let me pick up. Some very strong, well thought out comments from Brian. Honorable Minister, I'd like to come to you now to share your thoughts after those words from Brian.
Thank you. Let me first of all try to define what is interference. Interference is an intervention in a situation without being invited. That is the definition of interference. And I would also start that by saying that it is important to acknowledge that foreign interference is not a new phenomenon. And it is not just about Africa. It is, interference has been existing in various forms throughout the history, and it will persist in the years to come. States will always try to influence others for their own political interest or economic, trade, and whatever. And in Africa, we have witnessed foreign interference during the colonial era, of course, as outside sought to exert control over the continent and exploit its resources. That interference has persisted during the colonization process and even after the attainment of independence. During the colonization process, colonial powers made whatever they could just to keep the control of the countries they had colonized, even after having left them when they became independent. And after the independence, we saw very, very many examples of foreign interference on our continent, where many coups were conducted with the support of these foreign powers, the former colonial powers. In some cases, we even witnessed a case where someone was put on a plane and brought in his own country to become president. And those are examples, that was in Central African Republic. So those are examples of foreign interference on our continent at many occasions. We have also seen the influence of external actors in Africa's political affairs, our economic systems, and social structures. Someone referred to homosexuality and so on and so forth. This is one way to interfere in our social structures. However, it is crucial to recognize that foreign interference, as I mentioned, is not exclusive to our continent. It occurs in various regions across the globe, and foreign interference can also come from closer to home. It doesn't need to come from Europe or from America, from Asia. It can come from closer to home, from other countries on our continent, and it can be just as destabilizing as interference from other continents. And I would say that it is I already mentioned it is normal that states try to influence policies of their neighbors or far away, just for their own interests. But Africa can resist harmful interference or minimize its impact. And every country can resist that interference or just minimize its impact. We must recognize that while external powers may seek to assert their influence based on their own national interests, it is ultimately our responsibility to safeguard our sovereignty, define our interests, and the path to achieve those priorities. So strengthening our capacity to define our own policies, to own them, and to implement them for the benefit of our people is crucial for our countries, for our state, to limit interference from foreign powers, or just to minimize the impact of such interference. So strengthening our governance and building strong, inclusive state is an essential step. A robust, transparent, and accountable governance system can deter external forces from exploiting vulnerabilities within a country and a continent. And additionally, providing opportunities to our citizens, fostering socio-economic development, curbing corruption, and cultivating a strong social fabric can make our countries more attractive for mutually beneficial partnerships as opposed to harmful interference. So we need really to own our own development, put in place the right policies, implement them, make sure that our people own those policies, and we need to implement them for the benefit of everyone. We need to be inclusive. And this will limit the vulnerability of our states to foreign interference. We should not keep blaming others for interference because it is counterproductive. Instead, we must invest in building our own capacity and capabilities to prevent and address interference effectively. Given how small the world has become and how we are all linked, whether we like it or not, including by common global threats such as terrorism and climate change, our focus should be on building mutually beneficial partnerships. But for us to be able to talk even about partnership, it is important that our states, that our continent have that capacity to know what we need for our continent, for our state, to define the right policies, to adopt the right laws, and to build strong regional blocks, and make sure that we know what we want and how we can push forward our own interests and be able also to deal with the interests of others so that we can eventually achieve the partnership I just talked about. So strong states are the building blocks for productive regional integration and successful continental integration. The more we are able to do in our own countries, the more useful we are to each other. Africa has put in place some policies. We have adopted a few instruments which will help the continent to be integrated, to help the integration agenda of the continent. One of these instruments is the African Continental Free Trade Area. Once that instrument is adopted by everyone and is implemented, it is an example of an instrument which will give Africa the capacity to deal with other continents, with other foreign states, and build the partnership we want. It will limit also the interference of others in our policies as we be able to push forward our own interests as a continent. And to build a strong continent, we need to start by building strong regional blocs. We have these regional economic communities. We need to strengthen them. They will contribute to the integration of the whole continent, and we need to own all these instruments we have adopted at the African Union to make sure that Africa can become relevant in the international politics, and we limit the interference, but rather push forward partnership with other blocs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Honorable Minister. Just before I move on, a quick question. You gave us a very nice short definition for interference. Is there such a thing as good interference?
Interference cannot be good. Let me say, as long as you use interference, I don't see interference being a good thing. Interaction can be good, because interaction means that you are taking into consideration the interest or the idea of the partner, but interference means that you are intervening without being invited. Okay, you can engage a partner without really interfering in his own policies or governance system.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I want to turn my attention to our spokesperson, if I can come to you. And I believe you're going to speak in French, so please turn to Channel 2 if your address is going to be in French. Channel 1, I beg your pardon. If you can switch on to Channel 1 for the English translation. I'd like to invite you, sir, to share your thoughts on this topic about, and especially how you define interference and your thoughts, especially from the Commission's point of view. You're very welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Maybe because of foreign interference, I'm going to speak in French, not in English. Alors, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, pour moi-même, me trouver à Kigali, cette perle des villes africaines, est un réel plaisir. Être dans cette salle où, en 2016, il a été décidé la réforme institutionnelle de l'Union africaine et qu'on a confiée au président Paul Kagame. Être dans cette salle où il y a 4 ans, là où je suis assis, a été adoptée la zone de libre-échange continentale et a été signée dans cette salle. Symboliquement, c'est quelque chose qui me touche particulièrement. Et surtout que nous sommes à une semaine de la commémoration du 60e anniversaire de l'Organisation de l'Unité africaine. Je crois que le moment est bien choisi, tout comme le lieu, pour réfléchir sur une question fondamentale qui est celle du facteur extérieur sur les questions de paix et sécurité en Afrique. Je remercie donc les forces de défense et de sécurité du Rwanda de m'inviter pour échanger avec vous également sur cette problématique vitale pour notre continent. Je crois que les collègues ici l'ont évoqué, un bref rappel historique est nécessaire pour saisir la problématique. L'Afrique est un espace géographique et humain qui a été conquis, occupé, recomposé, façonné par des puissances extérieures. Comme le dit Vincent, c'est une interférence, donc ces gens-là n'ont pas été invités. Ils se sont invités, ils ont occupé, ils ont façonné un espace humain, c'est là depuis plus d'un siècle. On a connu la traite négrière, on a connu la colonisation sous toutes ses formes. Donc l'élément ingérence extérieure est présent depuis longtemps dans le continent africain. Cet espace a été partagé en zones d'influence en zone d'influence. Et même si on a eu nos indépendances assez formelles en 1960 pour la plupart des États africains, les formes d'ingérence, parfois même directes, violentes, existent jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Elles prennent diverses formes. Ingérence politique et diplomatique, interférence militaire, il y a des bases militaires terrestres, aériennes et navales dans le continent. Il y a le financement des mercenaires. Il est arrivé le fameux Bob Denard, le très célèbre, qui a fait et défait du gouvernement dans ce continent. Le financement des milices. Même les opérations de maintien de la paix, parfois, prennent une dimension qui est totalement contraire à celle pour laquelle elles ont été conçues. Il y a 10 ans, je me souviens et j'ai retrouvé mon ami le général Kagoro qui est dans la salle. J'étais parti au nord du Mali, à Tessalit. J'étais ministre des Affaires étrangères du Tchad. Il y avait la mission donc, des Nations Unies où des contingents ont été déployés à l'extrême nord du Mali, parce que de Bamako à Tessalit, il faut 2h30 d'avion pour y arriver. 10 ans après, malgré la présence d'une mission de maintien de la paix, malgré la présence d'autres forces, parfois à la demande du pays lui-même, la paix n'est pas revenue dans ces pays. Et aujourd'hui, si on analyse la situation au Mali et dans la région du Sahel, on est en droit de nous interroger sur la pertinence d'un certain nombre d'actions, conscientes ou inconscientes, qui n'ont pas donné les résultats attendus. Dans tout conflit, en Afrique en tout cas, très souvent, il y a le facteur d'ingérence extérieure. Parfois comme cause du conflit, mais dans tous les cas, un élément de complexification de ce conflit. Complexification de ce conflit. Très souvent, l'Afrique est apparue comme une terre de proxy war, de guerre par procuration. J'ai dit ça, ce n'est pas pour nous dédouaner de nos propres responsabilités en tant qu'Africains. Particulièrement ceux qui sont en charge, les responsables, les leaders du continent africain. Notre responsabilité est totale. Ces ingérences, souvent, sont accompagnées, sollicitées par des Africains eux-mêmes. Il y a également la situation du continent qui, au niveau de la gouvernance mondiale, n'occupe pas la place qui devrait lui revenir par le nombre de ses habitants, par le nombre des États qui sont membres, par exemple, des Nations Unies. Il y a également la faiblesse, et c'est là où le bas blesse, la faiblesse de la solidarité africaine, intra-africaine elle-même. Très souvent, des gouvernements justifient leur appel à des forces extérieures par le fait qu'elles ne sont pas capables elles-mêmes de faire face à une situation, et donc elles ont recours à des forces extérieures pour pouvoir les soutenir, pour maintenir la paix ou la sécurité dans leur territoire. Quelles sont les solutions? C'est ça le plus important. À l'Union africaine, qui a fêté il y a quelques mois son 20e anniversaire, il y a des instruments théoriques. Il y a une stratégie pour la paix et la sécurité en Afrique, il y a des forces en attente, on a un conseil paix et sécurité. Nous avons l'architecture institutionnelle pour faire face, assurer ce qu'on appelle la sécurité collective du continent. Mais à l'examen, il faut le reconnaître, ceci n'a pas été opérationnalisé. Et très souvent, jusqu'à aujourd'hui, nous n'avons pas été capables d'assurer le début même de cette sécurité collective. c'est qu'il laisse les champs libres à toutes les forces extérieures, quelle que soit leur forme, de pouvoir intervenir allègrement sur les dossiers africains. Ceci avec, je me répète, avec la complicité des Africains eux-mêmes. Il y a, au moment où nous fêtons le 60e anniversaire de l'OUA, une baisse du panafricanisme, aussi paradoxal que cela puisse paraître. Les pères des indépendances étaient plus nationalistes, étaient plus panafricanistes que les leaders actuels. Et ça, c'est quelque chose d'extrêmement grave. Je crois qu'il y a une nécessité d'un éveil de conscience pour pouvoir faire face à cette triste réalité. Ce n'est pas en incriminant les autres, comme l'a dit le ministre Biruta. Je crois qu'il faut que nous-mêmes, on fasse une certaine introspection pour pouvoir analyser la situation dans laquelle on se trouve, d'autant plus que, et là aussi, nous fêtons pratiquement 10 ans avec l'agenda 2063. On a terminé le premier plan décennal et l'agenda 2063 se résume une Afrique intégrée, une Afrique prospère, une Afrique en paix. C'est ces triptyques-là que nous nous sommes fixés comme objectif. Sans l'intégration, on ne peut pas parler de sécurité collective. Sans l'intégration, on ne peut pas parler de prospérité. Sans paix, on ne peut pas assurer l'intégration ni la prospérité. Et donc, il y a une véritable nécessité pour les Africains, pour l'élite africaine, pour le leadership africain, de faire cette analyse et de s'engager résolument. Parce que sans cela, il n'y a pas de salut. Et tant qu'on laissera la porte grandement ouverte, tant qu'on tendra les mains sur le plan économique, sur le plan politique, sur le plan diplomatique à l'autre, mais l'autre ne se fera jamais de scrupules. Et celui qui forçait les portes trouve les portes largement ouvertes, eh bien, il va y arriver. Merci.
Merci. Thank you. Chairperson, thank you very much indeed. And now let me move on to our fourth and final speaker so that we can get into the meat of the discussion. PLO, it's your chance to lay out your thoughts. Karibu.
Thank you very much. Let me thank those who have spoken before me and remind us that interference in Africa started with slavery. When slavery had lost its value, it graduated into colonization. And that is the context in which Berlin must be seen when the European powers sat in Berlin and divided the continent of Africa into spheres of influence. When colonization had lost its luster through a combination of certain realities and agitation from the continent, we regained our independence. But as John Henry Clark, that great African-American, said, we regained independence by mimicking European governance systems. And he rightly says, no African country will ever succeed on the basis of those systems. After that, the neo-colonial project was instituted. And all of us will remember Kwame Nkrumah's book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And he there says, the most dangerous. We are now in a neo-colonial stage when the European powers are at their most diabolical, when the Americans are at their most diabolical. And it's not lost on me that they'll be meeting in Hiroshima next week as the G7. And how do they interfere? They interfere militarily. They ensure that you in the military are trained in Sandhurst, are trained in West Point, so they affect your mind. They interfere diplomatically, sometimes through gunboat diplomacy, and that is why you see sometimes your typical European ambassador treats our heads of states in a condescending manner. They interfere through institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. They interfere by ensuring that our economic infrastructure is beholden to theirs through dollarization. They interfere through education. They interfere by influencing our processes, by lending us advisors who tell us what to do. The neo-colonial project is alive and well, and it is at its most dangerous, and we Africans must smell the coffee. If we don't, they are going to continue to interfere. How else do they interfere? Through NGOs, Danida, CEDA, UK Aid, USAID. These are Trojan horses that are introduced into our countries for the purpose of influencing our processes. And they infiltrate our institutions. Right now, if you look at the African Development Bank, look at the shareholding. It's Americans, it's Germans, it's Japanese, it's the French. And the Europeans have done their bit. They also interfere through post-colonial institutions, the Commonwealth of independent nations. They are not sovereign states, former French-speaking nations. These are the instruments that they interfere through. And how do we then deal with this situation? We Africans must now begin to recognize, and this was recognized as early as 1963, and the chair of the commission is here. They'll be celebrating 60 years in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And 60 years ago, on the 24th day of May, Kwame Nkrumah warned us. He said, if we are not united, they are going to interfere with us militarily. They are going to interfere with our economy. They are going to interfere with our agriculture. They are going to interfere with our health. Our duty, and I hope that when African heads of states and government meet in Addis next week, it will not be another jamboree at which pro forma speeches are read. I hope it will be an occasion to give meaning to Africa Agenda 2063. I hope it will be an occasion to give meaning to Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I hope it will be an occasion to revitalize the Malabo Declaration, the Maputo Declaration, the Yamoussoukro Declaration. In other words, we Africans, as I conclude, we Africans must stop operating in silos. Rwanda alone will not confront them. Burundi alone will not confront them. But if we go through the regional bodies and ultimately the African Union, we may indeed succeed in putting away this bulwark. And remember, it is no longer just Europe. There is a new scramble for Africa. The Chinese are here. The Turks are here. The Qataris are here. All of them are coming back. And the military bases that you see here is telling you that if you don't behave, we are going to use force. Sometimes I wish, and I'm saying this seriously, that we too had a nuclear weapon, because that is what Europe and America understands. Thank you.
Prof, thank you very much indeed. For now, maybe this is just a we'll declare a ceasefire for the moment. Now, thank you, Prof. Let me throw this question, and I'll come to you, Brian. I think Lumumba PLO took us through those stages. It's been 60 years plus we've had this. We're actually calling it the Enduring Destabilising Factor. Why is it so difficult to really tackle this issue? Why is it taking us so long?
I think the most fundamental challenge is not white supremacy. It's black inferiority and the abiding appetite amongst the black elite to function on the basis of white embrace. Number one. If we ourselves, even our thieves, are not patriotic, when they steal from Africa, they invest in Europe. They don't believe. The minister said, fix our own governance system. The people in charge of governance system steal and invest elsewhere as an indictment or an affirmation of their own incompetence and incapacity. But the second bit is that I think both His Excellency Moussa Faki, Professor Lumumba, and the minister indicated, when you grow a disconnect between the people who give you legitimacy, who are the ultimate resource for the transformation of any nation, when you grow a disconnect between your culture, Amilcar Cabral said, every revolution is first a cultural revolution. A people must believe in themselves. That way they're able to produce both citizens and leaders who are not only patriotic and competent, but that are future-focused and that are regenerative. Unfortunately for us, we have constantly killed three forms of assets. First asset, we kill our babies and our young people by never exposing them. And Rwanda is an exception to this, to what it means to govern and what it means to negotiate, what it means to compete. Number two, you know, in all our countries, anybody, the age group of the people sitting at this table, when you are out of government, you are finished. The state has absolutely no use of the experience, the expertise, and the resources. We are constantly going elsewhere to look for experts that we either have in the diaspora or we have in our countries. The inability to build, retain, use our own local expertise and experience. The third is that we have created everything to be so leader-centric that most of our citizens either wait for God or wait for the leader or wait for foreigners. And the day must come in Africa where Pan-Africanism is Pan-Africanism of the people. No matter how brilliant institutions are, continental or regional, as long as they are not nourished by the ideas of African intellectuals, African artists and activists. But there is hope. Many of you may not see it as hope. The dominance of Afrobeat and Afropop in the world today, sending a message, if that can be used as a vehicle of cultural regeneration, if what the young people have been able to do with tech can be used as a way of reimagining, then what we're talking about as a phenomenon will end. The third is that we can't keep sending all our people. I know that it's maybe brain gain for some people. We can't keep sending all our young people to Europe, to America, and elsewhere without creating pathways back. Why? Frantz Fanon said they realized that the empire or the center came and took the best from amongst us and took them to their best institutions, and they emptied them of their own culture and their own sense of being, and they filled them with ideas of how to be good Europeans and Americans. And when they returned, their kith and kin realized that their children had not come back. What had come back were echoes of the empire. You and I, having had the opportunities to serve outside our continent, when we return, we're not trying to establish little Europe's, little France, little America. There must be an authentic way. That's why Rwanda's revolution is not only leadership, it is homegrown solutions, not for Rwanda only, but for the whole world, not just for Africa. We cannot assert ourselves culturally, intellectually, spiritually, as long as we are leprous and dependent.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much indeed. Honorable Minister, I'm going to turn to you now. We're laying this problem firmly at the feet of the foreigner. But what is our responsibility as Africans? Brian mentioned the issue of patriotism. How we also carry the blame. We are the people who are complicit in all this. What are your thoughts on this?
I think I already mentioned, I already said something about this. Foreign interference is real on our continent. It was here during the colonization time and even after the independence. But we cannot sit here and keep blaming others without ourselves. We are just able to analyze and see that foreign interference has done bad to our continent. But now we know. We should do something about it. And we need to start by owning our own development, as I mentioned earlier. We need to put in place the right policies for our continent. We need to build regional integration and later on continental integration. We have the Agenda 2063 for the African Union. We know what we need to do, and we should just do that. So blaming others, it's fine, but we need to stop and start just addressing the issues we know very well. And we cannot neither close the continent and consider that all others are bad. This is not possible. It is not even realistic. We need to work with others, and we need to go and train in America, in Europe, and wherever. But we need to train there. We need to study there, knowing very well that we are doing that for our continent, for our countries to benefit from those trainings. So we need to be conscious that we need to develop our own countries and our own continent. We cannot keep blaming everybody else except ourselves, because we have the diagnosis is there. We know our problem. We know the solution. We need to implement it. And as I mentioned earlier, we just need to own our development. We need to have the courage to adopt the right policies and to implement them. And we need also to know, to develop our capacity to deal with foreigners who are coming to our countries. If Americans have USAID, if others have SIDA, if others have NABER or whatever, it is good. Now it is upon me, upon Rwanda, upon any African state to know the better way to use these mechanisms which are there for the benefit of our own people. We should be able to tell these partners that this is the development path we want to take. If we want to work with us, this is the way we want to go, and to be able to orient them to own it. Otherwise, if we consider that they are there, and when they come to us, we just need to accept whatever they bring to us, this is not their problem, it is our problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me turn to you, Chairperson. Now, we're here fighting huge global forces, international financial systems that are skewed against us, and you've laid out some steps, some of the instruments that are available and open to Africa to try, including integration, to try and address this problem. But I wonder if, as a continent, we can't produce a passport for all Africans, how are we going to deal with these other huge things if we can't even produce a paper document that is acceptable in all our countries?
Oui, je crois qu'après 60 ans, ne serait-ce qu'en prenant la date de naissance de l'OUA, il y a 60 ans, je crois que c'était un moment pour faire le bilan. On l'a fait au 50e anniversaire, c'est là où nous avons adopté l'agenda 2063. Le problème, c'est d'être conséquent et de mettre en œuvre ce que nous avons décidé. Il y a des décisions, il y a des institutions, il y a des programmes, il y a même un agenda qui sont très bien élaborés. Le problème réside sur la mise en œuvre. La question du passeport, la question de la libre circulation des biens et des personnes. Il y a un protocole qui a été signé depuis bientôt 10 ans, 2014, sur la libre circulation. Jusqu'aujourd'hui, on n'a pas eu 15 États qui l'ont ratifié pour qu'il entre en vigueur. 10 ans après. On est venu ici, on a signé sur cette place-là la zone de libre-échange continentale. Comment on peut implémenter la zone de libre-échange continentale si on ne permet pas aux Africains d'aller et venir? La libre circulation, c'est ça l'une des contradictions à laquelle on fait face avec nos États membres. Je crois que c'est une question de responsabilité. Aujourd'hui, on sent un divorce entre les populations et les leaderships. La population est majoritairement jeune, elle veut le changement, elle veut vivre. Et donc, je crois que nous sommes à des moments où il faut être conséquent. On connaît le contexte dans lequel nous nous trouvons. On sait ce que nous avons subi. Il n'y a pas de pardon. En ce moment, nous sommes avertis. C'est pour cela que la responsabilité première est la nôtre. La question de la bonne gouvernance. Plus le leadership est en relation directe et en conformité avec les aspirations de ses concitoyens, mieux il est respecté et mieux il peut mettre en œuvre ce qu'il aura été décidé. Donc, c'est là où se situe la vraie problématique. Sur le plan global, nous sommes un continent, nous sommes aujourd'hui certains que les États africains pris individuellement ne peuvent pas peser. Nous avons des communautés économiques régionales, SADC, ECOWAS, ECAS, IGAD, etc. Nous avons, dans le cadre de la réforme, depuis 2019, instauré un sommet de coordination chaque année. Cette année, c'est le 18 juillet, il va se tenir à Nairobi, au Kenya, où les responsables des différentes communautés économiques régionales et la Commission de l'Union africaine et le bureau de la conférence se retrouvent pour analyser la situation économique et de développement dans le continent. Mais il y a une contradiction entre ce qu'on décide et ce qu'on met en œuvre. Et le cas du passeport est l'un de ces points. Même en utilisant nos passeports nationaux, il suffit de ratifier cette convention, ce protocole, pour que je puisse prendre mon passeport, aller dans n'importe quel pays africain, rentrer dans ces territoires, m'installer et faire des affaires, par exemple. On ne peut pas faire du commerce si on n'assure pas la libre circulation des biens et des personnes. Et donc, l'un des problèmes auxquels nous sommes confrontés aujourd'hui, c'est la mise en œuvre de ce qu'on aura décidé, et notamment le protocole sur la libre circulation des biens et des personnes. On a encore moins de 10 États. Heureusement, le Rwanda fait partie des premiers États à avoir ratifié ce protocole. Et chaque sommet, on rappelle aux États qu'il faut ratifier cet accord, ne serait-ce que pour mettre en œuvre la zone de libre-échange continentale. Nous ne sommes pas une contradiction près, malheureusement.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. PLO, your thoughts as well on why it has taken us so long?
Yeah, I'll answer your question, but I must also respond to what I hear the minister saying. First of all, when we talk the way we do, we are not blaming anybody. The impact of European and American and Russian and Chinese interference is a raw wound. It is not something that is in the past. It is something that is happening as we speak. And therefore, when we speak to it, we are speaking to it to warn ourselves of the reality. When we speak about the Danidas and the NGOs, these are bodies whose raison d'etre is to ensure that we remain in a perpetual state of begging. That is what we are doing to warn ourselves. And we are not for 1 minute saying that we will shut ourselves out from the rest of the world. What we are saying is that we must define how we engage with the whole world. And we are saying that as individual countries, we are weak, and the rest of the world wants to operate and to deal with us in our weak state. The United States of America are dealing with Rwanda on second-hand clothing. Rwanda cannot resist them. Burundi cannot. Kenya cannot. Uganda cannot. But if we are East Africa with a population of 300 million, we can. If we are SADC, we can. If we are ECOWAS, we can. So this is what we are saying. And we are saying further that going forward, we must also recognize our internal weaknesses. And what is our weaknesses? Chinua Achebe said it very well. The problem of Africa is simply and squarely one of political leadership. The rank of many political leaders in Africa are thieves. Let's call them by their name. They are thieves. They are individuals who are not interested in the interest of this country. And as long as we continue electing such individuals into positions of power across Africa, they are going to be manipulated. What then is the responsibility of the citizenry? The responsibility of the citizenry is to make demands. The chairman here, I hope he has received the several letters that I have written to him. I've written several letters to his organization, talking about the role of the African Union in peacemaking. I wrote to the chairman only last week about the situation in Sudan, saying we must solve our own problems. And I want to see a crusading African Union, so that it's not the Americans and the Saudi Arabians who are summoning them to Jeddah. It should be in Addis Ababa. In a nutshell, Joe, what I'm saying is that we have a responsibility to ourselves, both at the leadership level and at levels of the civic society. We must be engaged in a positive manner, and we must keep on shouting without being diplomatic, because diplomacy is lulling us into a false sense of security. And lastly, I want to say this. When foreign powers come, we must always be reminded of these goodies that they bring to us. It used to be said of the Trojan War that even when the Greeks bear a gift, they do not mean well. They never mean well. And the sooner we say it, recognizing the external threat, recognizing the domestic weaknesses, the safer we are. Right now, as I conclude, there is a group of experts going around East Africa, collecting views about the constitution of East Africa. I've just written to them this morning. They are leaving Kenya. If you ask 10 Kenyans, possibly only one knows they are in Kenya. Then they will be going to Burundi. If you ask your typical African about Africa Agenda 2063 out of 10, if 2 know about Africa Agenda 2063, you'll be lucky. If you ask them about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area 10, if 2 know, you'll be lucky. In other words, we are not doing well. And I'm going to be blunt at these functions. If you ask the chair of the African Union who funds the African Union, possibly 60% of the budget is externally funded. He who pays the piper calls the tune. That is the reality of the world. We must begin to pay for our own things in order to be understood and to be respected. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think let me give a right of reply to Chairperson to that comment about the AU funding. But before then, the good professor says he has sent some good letters with good ideas to you.
Assuming he receives them or they are caught up in the bureaucracy.
So maybe you'll let him know whether his message has reached. But most importantly, if the AU is dependent on external funding, then where are we at in terms of trying to be independent of these interfering forces?
Ce que dit le professeur est vrai, et ce n'est un secret pour personne. Si en 2016 et 2017, il a été décidé de procéder à une réforme sur le financement de l'Union africaine, c'est parce que le constat a été fait que l'essentiel de notre budget est financé de l'extérieur. En juillet 2016, ici à Kigali, les chefs d'État ont tenu une retraite. Ils ont retenu un certain nombre de propositions qu'ils ont adoptées en janvier 2017 à Addis Ababa sur le financement, notamment en prélevant 0,2% sur les importations au niveau des États africains. 7 ans après, peut-être la moitié des États ont accepté ces modes de financement. Les autres ne l'ont pas accepté. C'est pour cela que j'ai dit qu'on prend des très belles décisions, mais on ne les applique pas. Professeur, l'Union africaine, c'est la somme des États africains pris individuellement, qui sont extrêmement jaloux de leur souveraineté étriquée, tout en sachant que les États, comme vous l'avez dit, pris individuellement, ne pèsent pas. Même les communautés régionales seules ne suffisent pas. Mais avec 1,4 milliard d'habitants, l'ensemble des États de l'Union africaine, je crois que l'Afrique peut peser. Encore faut-il avoir le courage politique d'être conséquent, de commencer à nettoyer sa propre maison, en étant conséquent, en appliquant les règles qu'on s'est fixées nous-mêmes. En se prenant au sérieux, les autres peuvent nous prendre au sérieux. Je l'ai dit, je suis à ma 7e année comme président de la Commission de l'Union africaine. Le président de la Commission de l'Union africaine n'a pas de pouvoir. Le pouvoir appartient aux États. Le pouvoir appartient aux chefs d'État qui refusent de mettre en œuvre les décisions qui sont prises. Et en faisant ainsi, ils fragilisent l'ensemble qu'on a mis en place. Je crois qu'on se rend à l'évidence. Après 60 ans, je crois que c'est largement suffisant pour faire le point et ensemble, il y a sans doute, ensemble, nous pouvons changer les choses. Avec 1,4 milliard d'habitants, nous ne sommes pas membres permanents du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, alors que 60-70% des sujets sur la paix et le maintien de la paix concernent le continent africain. Jusqu'à là, cette réforme n'a pas eu lieu. Quel est notre poids au FMI? 6,5%. Quel est notre poids à la Banque mondiale? Dernièrement, on est en train de nous faire des concessions, on peut peut-être nous accepter comme membre du G20. Je crois que nous nous sous-estimons nous-mêmes et je crois qu'il est temps d'avoir le courage, je dis bien vraiment le courage de décider ensemble et je crois qu'aussi on peut faire bouger les choses. C'est comme ça que les choses se présentent de manière crue, je ne parle pas diplomatiquement, ce n'est pas le lieu, je parle à des officiers, à des militaires qui sont appelés généralement à exécuter leurs ordres qui leur sont donnés pour maintenir la paix, la sécurité et la stabilité dans le continent. Il y a un problème politique de fond dans notre continent. Plus nous évoluons, maintenant les interventions deviennent même plus subtiles. Elles deviennent plus subtiles. Elles sont culturelles, elles sont dans les médias, elles sont dans les réseaux sociaux. On peut influencer aujourd'hui une opinion autrement. Ça c'est sophistique. Et dans ces conditions-là, il faut au moins que les décisions qui sont prises, nous connaissons. L'état de lieu a été fait. Tout le monde est conscient de cette nécessité de pouvoir faire cette autocritique et prendre les décisions qui s'imposent à nous en ce moment. C'est une question de leadership, c'est une question de responsabilité historique. Merci.
Thank you, sir. Just a quick clarification. With that issue, is the problem lack of resources or lack of political will when it comes to the member states?
Je crois que d'abord, c'est une question de manque de volonté politique. Nous sommes 1,4 milliard. Nous sommes un territoire riche. On peut prélever 0,2%. Ce n'est pas une grande somme. Si on fait ça, les études ont été faites, les schémas ont été faits, on peut au moins nous autofinancer. Mais quand vous tendez la main, naturellement, la main qui donne est toujours au-dessus de celle qui reçoit. C'est aussi évident que ça.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to pause here. It's a good juncture to pause for our tea break. We'll have a short tea break for 30 minutes. We'll come back and continue. Hopefully, I'll still have the full panel in front of me. And then we can continue with your questions as well and interactions. To my panelists, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, the panel, for a very interesting first part of the session today. We are going to have tea right now, and the first 3 rows will exit through the left. Our protocol will help indicate where they will be going to, and then the rest will use the right. This time it's the other way around. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for part 2 of our discussion this morning. And as you prepare your questions as well to the panel, just before we begin, I'm reminded of a true incident that happened once. We had this couple, this family, British family that lived in Kenya for many years. And they had this, one of the people who was helping them at home with family and driving and so on, who really worked very well with this particular family. And then the family, it came a time now when the family needed to relocate back to the UK. And they were so happy with the services of this guy that they offered him a free trip to the UK to come and tour, and just kind of to thank him for the support he was giving the family. And this man took off his first time on an aircraft and so on, and they asked him, there's so many attractions in London and other places. What is the thing that you really, really want to do? Where do you really want to see, and so on? And the guy had a very humble request. I just want to get into a black taxi, the London black cabs. And they found it very usual. Of all the, but that you can do anywhere. Nairobi also has a few black cabs, not anymore. He said, no, that's all I need. And so he got into one of the taxis, and he was driven around, and he was the happiest man. They didn't understand why the attraction to the black taxi. And then, he got out after possibly less than an hour. It is only later they learned the only reason he wanted to get into a black cab and sit on the back seat on the left-hand side where all the great honorees sit was to be driven by a white British driver. We call it reparations in his context. Okay, you will understand the joke later. It was a true story, and that was all he desired to see. So we are now back. Time to take your questions. We will try and take as many as possible because I know this is a really critical issue. So if you kindly put up your hands, I wear my glasses so I can see. I will point out. Wow. We will take that as the first. I'm just pointing them out, and then we'll take maybe 3, 4 at a time. There is a hand right here. Just in the middle. Yes, please. Yeah. So if you can hold on to that. And then, yes, that will be, so you'll be number 1, sir. And there will be a number 2 over there. And then let me look. Sir, your hand has been up. Your position number 3. And number 4 behind you. But before that, where is Eduardo Sito? You had lobbied to say something in advance, if you're here, from the University of Mozambique. Eduardo, are you around anywhere? Oh, okay. Let's start with you, because you used the AU mechanism to lobby your question to reach us in advance. Yeah, we'll give you an opportunity. Please, the rule is very simple. Give us your name, who you are, what you do, very briefly, and then if you can make your question as short, direct as possible, and tell us who you're directing the question to, if possible. So, Eduardo, over to you, and then we will follow that. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Eduardo Sitoy. I come from Mozambique. I'm professor at Eduardo Mondlane University, Maputo. I think I'm the only one who speaks Portuguese here. Oh, okay. So there are 2 people who can also speak Portuguese. First of all, I would like to thank the Rwanda Defense Force and Command and Staff College for inviting me to this very important symposium. And my contribution will be on the definition of foreign interference. I have to recognize that the members of the panel, Professor Lumumba, but most particularly the Honorable Foreign Minister of the Republic of Rwanda gave us a very good working definition of foreign interference. I want to start by saying that there is a difference between foreign intervention and foreign interference. All foreign interference is a case of foreign intervention, but not all foreign intervention is a case of foreign interference. The Honorable Minister there said that foreign intervention amounts to foreign interference if that intervention is not invited for by the host government. That's right. For instance, in Mozambique currently, we have SADC forces. They were object of a bilateral agreement between the SADC and Mozambique. Likewise, the Rwandan Defense Force and the Rwanda National Police are in Mozambique, are doing well. They've made possible that the district of Palma and Musimba de Praia in the Cabo Delgado province are now free from the insurgency. And so the French multinational company Total Energies can come back if they wish to. So that is foreign intervention, but it's not foreign interference because they've been invited. But there are cases where there's no invitation, but that foreign intervention is not foreign interference. It may happen if, for instance, a particular regime, a government, decides to eliminate an ethnic group, a minority ethnic group in that country. So there is a duty of the international community to intervene in that country to protect that ethnic group that's in danger of elimination. So you may have foreign intervention that is not a case of foreign interference. So coming back to foreign interference is not just a foreign intervention without invitation by the host government. Foreign interference is mostly defined by the purpose of the intervening forces, whether powerful states or international organizations who intervene to further their own self-interest motives. So it's the selfishness of the intervention that gives the proper definition of the foreign intervention as a case of foreign interference. That was my small contribution I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eduardo. Thanks a lot indeed. So I'll move on straight to our number one question, please, or comment.
Good morning. My name is Afzal Ashraf, and I had the privilege of being on the first panel yesterday. And I'd like to thank everybody for taking some of those thoughts to the next stage, as you've all done admirably today. I would suggest that for me anyway, listening to this awesome panel, the point that came through was that there is an increasing recognition of the threats and the challenges that Africa faces. My question really is, how do we go to the next stage of understanding of that threat? Now, there's a subtle differences. And I'm reminded of a Chinese strategist who most of the generals and most of the senior business leaders will have come across, because he's influential on strategic thinking. And one of the things he said is that if you know yourself and if you know your enemy, you will not be beaten in 1,000 battles. And in my own experience, working at the strategic level in conflicts, recent conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, one of the primary reasons why the most awesome military power in the history of mankind has failed in almost every single battle, every single war from Vietnam to the recent wars, is because they have failed to understand the threat, and they have failed to understand their own abilities. So the two sort of questions that come out of that are that, and Mr. Brian Kagoro made some very good points, and one of those points was that we need to be aware of the interference that might come about through NGOs and through religious organizations. But my question is, how do you differentiate or discriminate between the interference from malign organizations, which of course you're concerned about, and the benefits from those that are going to do good, those organizations that are motivated by love, by harmony, by unity, as opposed to those that are motivated by sectarianism, division, and hatred. The second question that I would, and I have a little bit of trepidation in posing that question, because I fit some of those categories that Professor Lumumba identified as potential hostile agents. I was trained in the Air Force equivalent of Sandhurst. I'm a member of the British, or was a member of the British Foreign Ministry, and many organizations that you rightly are worried about. I wonder if we understand the other, those, the threat that I think you rightly pose. Do you understand it well enough? When you talk about the West, do we realize that there is a difference between the power structures? Like all power structures, they are amoral, they are exploitative, they're maximizing in power, and the people who are driven by principles and values. I certainly was not aware of the amazing detail that you have all given us in terms of the exploitation that goes in the West. About 5-6 years ago, I teach at a university, and we started to decolonize the curriculum. That's 5 years ago. Now you're talked very rightly about neocolonialism. Maybe in about 10, 15, 20 years' time, we'll start to decolonize the neocolonial curriculum. That's too late for Africa. So this narrative, talked about narrative. Narrative, I put it to you respectfully, sirs, is the weapon of warfare, not nuclear weapons, not other kinds of weapons, and I speak as somebody who has been at the cutting edge of weapon technology. They have failed to deliver success. But narratives, and they're being used incredibly skillfully by Western nations, are what's dominant. And isn't it time that you got this legitimate of exploitation out to the British, the European, American, and Canadian populations who mean well for you as a continent, who care about other human beings, and who don't want exploitation in their name?
Thank you very much indeed. We'll take question number 2.
Bonjour à l'Assemblée. Je suis le colonel Maurice Ndion, attaché militaire du Sénégal au Rwanda, avec résidence à Addis Abeba. Ma question s'adresse au président de la Commission de l'Union africaine. Monsieur le Président, je pense que nous convenons que les mécanismes de soutien à l'architecture africaine de paix et de sécurité, APSA, des acteurs extra-africains ont une importance stratégique, tant ils tendent à modifier les rapports de force entre les différents acteurs africains et extra-africains, institutionnels et étatiques. Par conséquent, mon inquiétude est de savoir si les enjeux sont bien compris de nos dirigeants, qui, pour le financement de l'extension de la phase 1 de la transition d'ADMIS, se sont tournés vers l'Union européenne pour obtenir 85 millions d'euros. D'ailleurs, c'est dans ce cadre qu'un chef d'État, lors de la conférence des États contributeurs de troupes, s'est offusqué en disant que, vraiment, pour trouver 85 millions de dollars, il était décevant que 54 pays africains se tournent vers l'Union européenne. De ce fait, ma question est la suivante. Quelles sont les raisons qui poussent les États africains à accepter une relation de dépendance vis-à-vis des acteurs exogènes en matière de gestion des crises? Et comment concilier cette dépendance, cette posture à notre slogan qui veut bien dire solution africaine aux problèmes africains? Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Sir, give us your name, please, again.
Colonel Maurice Ndion.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Let me take these two, and then I'll come to my, the other two on this. So a couple of questions here. Brian, I believe you should handle the narratives. Prof, how do you distinguish those ones who come in peace and those ones who come otherwise? And then we'll also chip in, Minister, as we go along. Brian, over to you.
Yeah, I was going to be tempted, but I know PLO, you will handle this. Eduardo, most grateful to you, but as often happens in Pan-Africanist circles, I do not agree with the definition. And I'll tell you why, PLO, as a lawyer. You've heard me say this before. The intervention in Iraq was couched in very benign terms. The intervention in Libya was couched in benign terms. I could give you 100 interventions where the justification, objectively speaking, was on the basis that there was evidence either of genocide or evidence. I'm sitting in Rwanda. The international community stood by as the genocide against the Tutsi happened. Yet in the same year, they were intervening in West Africa. The construct of benign and malign is controlled and related to the question of narrative and strategic self-interest. We've often not paid enough attention, and thank you, Chairperson of the African Union, for educating us on how the international fora of decision-making, the Security Council, and other fora, including at some stage how we transact within the International Criminal Court and other platforms. That evidence, and that was my point, we don't control data, we don't control digital platforms, we therefore are not controlling narrative in both analog and digital forms. What can practically be done? We do need to speak to Europeans, not as victims, because the erasure of the contribution in European consciousness of Africans to modernity and civility has constructed a white supremacist view that sees the evolution of modernity as a singularly European contribution. And it is only now that our young researchers are beginning to excavate the contributions of black people, of Africans, towards inventions. Because until now, the province of economy was not the province of black people. In my country, in Zimbabwe, when land was taken, a British court gave a judgment that said, the question before them and who owned the land, they said, one thing is certain, it cannot be the native because the native has no sense of ownership. It was on that basis that land was taken. Number two, on the question of economics, even we pejoratively only talk about our people as informal law, informal economy, yet the informal economy is formal. That's how India developed through its cottage industry. That's how we have a psychotic addiction to colonial definitions of what, and that's why Professor Ashraf is correct. It's not just a narrative about our contribution historically, it's a narrative about our contribution now. Our young people who developed M-Pesa, which is now being used globally, who developed Ushahidi, which has been used by over 300,000 organizations, including the Japanese, the US military, and the NATO forces, are never sufficiently credited. Why? Because it is not in the current psyche of most Europeans possible that Africans are anything else except the object of charity that deserve our mercy and our pity. Why? Because they are governed by tyrants, right? Or Africans are incapable of ethics. And we've constantly said that Switzerland, which received the Abacha loot, which received the loot from the then Zaire and now DRC, has constantly been ranked in anti-corruption indices as the cleanest country in the world. PLO and I are lawyers. The receipt of stolen property is theft at law. How is it that you will have Nigeria and Kenya ranked so far, and yet the country that receives the money ranked so up? I think that if you're changing narrative, you also have to change behavior. Our African leaders and citizens constantly confirm the European caricature, an object of pity. When we come into these spaces, we can never transact revolution in courtesy. I like to be civil, to be courteous, right? But each time I start pointing to atrocities committed by African governments, the Europeans and the Americans cheer me up. Each time I refer to the historical atrocities and continuing atrocities committed first by governments and by companies that are dumping cyanide into our underground water and nuclear waste, right? You know what it is said? This is retrogressive. It's undermining investment. It's again, listen, we cannot win the narrative battle by arguing in pockets. They are happy us talking about our localized, indigenized oppression. They are never happy us talking about the question of distribution and redistribution of the global economy, of global power. And what Nkrumah and others realized in 1963 at the founding conference, if Africa is not represented, if Africa does not own its narrative, but you can't own your narrative if your leadership is totally disconnected from its people. You can't own your narrative if your intellectuals are totally disconnected. We have underinvested in rural areas and slums where the majority of our people are. In fact, we treat them as security threats and they are over-policed. Number two, we have underinvested in our academic and research institutions. We'd rather bring McKinsey and bring Deloitte and Touch. They will help us do AU reform. Why? Because there are no African consultancies that we know. Even if they exist, we have no relationship with them to help us with AU reforms, with anything else. And this is not a pronouncement on McKinsey or Deloitte. It's a pronouncement on ourselves. We have not, as a leadership, begun to recognize that the native is capable of knowledge. The native is capable of economy. The native is capable of invention. You can't change the narrative if the starting premise is we're trying to be like Europe and to catch up. We can't change the narrative when we're constantly trying to learn from others without understanding, and I'll end with that, what William Tunga said, the former Chief Justice of Kenya. He says, let's not engage in this romanticist view that there can only be one way to learn. We first must indigenize knowledge. That's what I said, learn from our culture and traditions. Number two, we must diversify who we learn from. We can not only learn from the West, we need to learn from everybody who has something to teach. Number three, we must domesticate what we learn. If we're going to learn anything, let's domesticate. I think the chairperson and the minister said it's consciousness. Narrative is first and foremost by realizing self-worth, self-belief, and looking inward, so that when you look outward, it is to supplement not a vacuous state of nothingness and inferiority, but it is to supplement a very stable, solid foundation where your culture, where your values, where your value for people is important.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me respond to the good professor's question by reminding us that the continent of Africa has tried several times to define herself in order to confront and engage. In the area of trade as early as 1980 under the Lagos Plan of Action, Africa took the view that in order to go forward, we must have a master plan of how we are going to have enhanced intra-African trade and intra-African engagement. Of course, the Lagos Plan of Action came a cropper, and in many ways, Africa Agenda 2063 is a rehash of the Lagos Plan of Action. In other words, Africa recognizes the need to define herself and to define her agenda. And I do not begrudge nations that define themselves and their agenda. Ronald Reagan once said it, and I agreed with him, that every nation does what is in her best interest. And I have no problem with that. The problem that we have is that at critical moments in African history, we have failed to seize the moment. You will remember in 1917 at the Champaran campaign, Mahatma Gandhi told Charlie Andrews, I do not want you to participate because at this point in time, the Indians must believe that they can do it themselves. In other words, there comes a time in the history of a nation when even friends of goodwill must be told, keep aside. We want to believe that we can do it, and your help must be surreptitious and subterranean if you are a person of goodwill. And the Champaran philosophy is what we must define for ourselves. In the year 2005, the former Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, put together 17 individuals in what was then called Our Common Interest, the report on the African Commission. The Prime Minister, he was then the President of the European Union, from which Britain has now left, and he was also the President of the G8 at that time before the exclusion of Russia. They produced a report. Right now, when I see the Blair Institute moving around Africa, they are implementing exactly what was in that particular report, and I have a copy of it, not for the benefit of Africa, but for the benefit of the Institute. And what they have done is to sugarcoat it and camouflage it for the purpose of hoodwinking Africa and for the purposes of creating an environment which benefits foreign companies to the detriment of the continent of Africa. So that some of these engagements are anodinal. They simply lull us into a false sense of security. Do I blame them? No. That is why I agree that we must decolonize all learning. I don't know who said it this, that if you have that the happiness of the slave is the comfort of the slave owner. And I am saying that if Africa does not recognize this, then Africa will never recognize and realize our potential. The saying goes that if you behave like grass, goats will eat you. And many times we in the African continent behave like grass, and we are fit for eating. And that is what I'm saying, going forward in a strategic engagement such as this, it is incumbent upon the continent of Africa, and remember I said there is a new scramble, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle. There was 1 month in this continent when the Russian foreign minister was here, the American foreign minister was here, the Chinese foreign minister was here, the French president was here, the Turkish president was here, within a period of 2 weeks. What were they looking for? What is in their best interest? They engaged little countries. They don't want to engage the East African community. They don't want to engage SADC. They don't want to engage ECOWAS, because when they are big, they are not manipulable. And when on the 14th and 15th days of last year, the African heads of states and government were summoned, and I use the word summoned very deliberately, to Washington, D.C. After the president had spoken to them and given them photo ops, Africa was given 60 billion. 54 countries, 60 billion. And then the American president started engaging in bilateral agreements with Burundi, with Lesotho, with Kenya. That is what we are saying, that going forward we must be conscious. And as to training, our own Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in a book called The River Between, tells his lead character Wayaki, go unto him, learn what he has taught you, but bring it home and customize it for the benefit of our people. Learning is universal and defies geography, but there is wisdom in using that learning for our benefit. And very lastly, how do we distinguish the institutional conceptual West, which is diabolical, and the individual members of those countries that actually sometimes are on our side? Institutionalized conceptual West, as articulated through government, is fundamentally diabolical. Their pretension to the contrary notwithstanding. And therefore, when we engage with them, we must have our guards up. We are capable, in my view, of discerning who is better, and that is the duty of our leadership. Our leadership doesn't do a good job out of it, and that is why the demand from the civil society, the demand from academia must remind leadership at all times, you are dining, and I'm using this as a term of art, that when you are dining with the devil, you must do so with a long spoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I don't know that you wanted to respond to the issue of definition earlier on, or indeed any comments that you might have.
Let us not drown ourselves in semantics. This is my view with due respect. First of all, let us remember that, and I always warn us Africans, if I was using my mother tongue to define interference, or using a Kiswahili word, what meaning would it carry? And sometimes we find ourselves prisoners of Portuguese, prisoners of French, prisoners of English, or any other colonial language which we have appropriated and which we now deploy in terms of engagement. History has demonstrated, and my good friend Kagoro said it, history has demonstrated not once, not twice, that the intentions appear to be noble in the beginning, but when they have come in like the proverbial Trojan horse, they go beyond their mandate. Show me what is happening to Libya today. Show me what is happening to the Central African Republic. Show me what is happening to Somalia today. They were all well-intentioned, and see the product. A tree shall be judged by its fruit. A mango that says it is an orange is still a mango. Thank you.
Okay, Honorable Biruta, over to you.
Yes, I think Professor Lumumba has said what I wanted to say. This is really semantics. I gave a general definition, kind of, but intervention and interference all depends on who invites or who justifies an intervention, and you can find nuances in various situations. Libya cases and Iraq cases were mentioned, and those who made those interventions will say that they were justified, and eventually that they were invited by people who were being threatened or killed. There was the case of Rwanda, where a foreign intervention was called for, not by the government, but by some other groups and by the people who were being threatened to be killed. So all this is all those are nuances you can find in various situations, but basically intervention where you have not been invited by a state is an interference. In intervention can be military, it could be cultural. You know, when you come to a country and you want to impose your own culture, your own beliefs, it is interference. So those are nuances. It is just semantics. We can find various situations where intervention relates to interference and where there are some differences. But on what Professor Lumumba just said, okay, African Union or Africa or African states are invited to various fora by various powers. Again, it is about us to know the reason why we are going there, for what? Should we go as individual state or as a continent, as a union? We have the power to decide that. And even if you go, all of us, if you go to the US or wherever, I guess that every leader who is going there has an agenda for his own country, for his own people. He's just not going there to get instructions or to sign whatever is presented to him. It comes back to us, the leadership. What do we want for our people? And how are we defending the interests of our people? We can do it individually as a state, and there is no small state. There are just states, a small one or a big one. A small state can even have the power to defend its own interests better than a big one. And it is also true that if we come together as regions or as a continent, we have a bargaining power. And we can deal with these big powers and be able to get our own interests through. But again, it is about us. We know all these problems. We know that all these powers are dealing with us. They are pursuing their own interests. Don't we have interests ourselves? Don't we know them? Can't we put them together and get a strategy agree on a strategy to defend our own interests? If we go, we discussed earlier on us going outside for studies and whatever. Yes, someone said we can learn and domesticate what we have learned from outside. And we need actually to know these societies we are dealing with. If we want to deal with China, if we want to do business with China, we need to know their society, their culture. So it comes back all the time to ourselves. How do we understand our own interests? How do we understand our development? And how we can achieve that? How do we go to those foreign powers to defend our own interests, the interests of our countries, individual countries, our regional blocks, or our continent? I think we have the power to achieve that. We need just to change our mindset and do the right things. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Chairperson, the question about EU funding, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Le colonel Diop a posé une question importante concernant le financement. Et c'est justement là où le bas blesse. Je rappelle qu'à partir de 2003, l'Union africaine a élaboré l'architecture africaine de paix et sécurité. African Peace Security Architecture. On a mis en place un conseil paix et sécurité. On a mis en place un panel des sages dans le cadre de la diplomatie préventive. On a décidé de former des forces africaines, les forces africaines en attente. Nous avons créé un fonds de la paix. Le continent est confronté à deux questions importantes. celle de la Corne de l'Afrique, donc ATMIS qui était précédée par AMISOM, et la question du Sahel. Sur la question du financement, les responsabilités sont partagées entre les États africains et la communauté internationale, notamment le Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Quand bien même le Conseil a qualifié El-Shabaab de groupe terroriste, il a qualifié AQMI, État islamique, Boko Haram et autres comme des mouvements terroristes. Le terroriste est une menace à la paix et à la sécurité internationale. C'est le Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies qui a la responsabilité en matière de maintien de la paix et de la sécurité. L'argument qui est le nôtre, celui de l'Afrique, depuis une dizaine d'années, au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, est que cette lutte doit être financée sur les ressources pérennes des Nations Unies. Ça n'a pas été le cas. C'est pourquoi il a fallu mettre en place la MISOM, avec la contribution des États de la région, et avec des financements des partenaires essentiellement de l'Union européenne. Il faut reconnaître quand même que l'Union européenne a dépensé pas moins de 4 milliards d'euros pour le financement de la MISOM depuis une quinzaine d'années. Quand bien même les forces sont des forces africaines mobilisées par des États essentiellement de la zone de l'Afrique de l'Est. Nous sommes arrivés depuis 2 ans à MISOM et maintenant nous sommes arrivés à ATMIS parce qu'il est question de préparer le retrait de cette mission et laisser la responsabilité aux forces de défense et de sécurité de la Somalie. Le constat est que, après une quinzaine d'années, jusqu'à aujourd'hui, la Somalie n'a pas les forces de défense et de sécurité nécessaires pour pouvoir assumer la responsabilité de protéger le pays. Al-Shabaab continue à survivre, ils sont résilients, ils ont des capacités de nuisance extraordinaires. Et les financements attendus des Nations Unies, conformément à la charte, ne sont pas disponibles. C'est la même chose au Sahel. D'abord, c'était une mission de l'Union africaine. Elle a été réunie par la MINUSMA au Mali. Le général Kagoro a été parmi les premiers responsables, chefs des casques bleus dans cette région il y a 10 ans, je rappelais. Et pendant 10 ans, nous avons toujours tablé des résolutions au nom de l'Union africaine au Conseil de sécurité pour dire que c'est une menace, c'est le terrorisme et l'intégrisme religieux, et donc il faut financer ces missions. Mieux, les États de la région, le G5, les 5 États du Sahel, ont mis en place une force. Chaque pays était disponible à mettre en place au moins 1000 hommes. On n'a pas pu avoir le financement qui était au départ estimé à 500 millions de dollars pour qu'il y ait une force africaine de la région avec un mandat offensif d'aller combattre les terroristes là où ils sont. On n'a pas eu le financement alors qu'il y a une mission des Nations Unies qui coûte au moins 1 milliard de dollars par an et qui est toujours au Mali. Ça, c'est une contradiction fondamentale sur la notion du maintien de la paix. Il n'y a pas de paix à maintenir au nord du Mali, dans le Sahel. Il y a une paix à imposer. Et pour imposer la paix, il faut un mandat offensif sous chapitre 7 pour que ces forces-là combattent les terroristes. Ça n'a pas été possible. Donc voilà les contradictions en matière de financement. Et donc, il n'est pas surprenant qu'aujourd'hui, avec ATMIS, la dernière réunion, je crois que le colonel a peut-être pris part, il était question d'évaluer le budget qui est nécessaire jusqu'à fin décembre 2024 pour finir la mission de ATMIS en Somalie. Il y a une estimation de quelques 85 millions de dollars qu'il faut pouvoir financer et ce financement a été demandé à l'Union européenne. C'est normal. Et donc, nous, au niveau du Fonds de la paix, nous avons pu les relancer depuis quelques années. Nous sommes aux alentours de 350 millions. Mais ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que ces fonds-là, si on les met pour des missions de maintien de la paix ou surtout d'imposition de la paix, ils ne seront pas suffisants. Parce que si vous avez 10 000 à 15 000 hommes qu'il faut payer le matériel qu'il faut payer, la logistique qu'il faut payer, cela ne peut pas être à la portée du Fonds de la paix tel qu'il est actuellement. Aujourd'hui, le débat, c'est comment alors mettre en place effectivement l'architecture africaine du maintien de la paix. Il faut se rappeler quand même, puisque les gens sont identifiés comme terroristes, il est même interdit de négocier avec ces mouvements. On ne peut pas interdire de négocier avec les mouvements, qu'il faut le combattre et ne pas se donner les moyens de le combattre. Ça, ce sont des questions fondamentales et je crois que 10 ans, 15 ans après, il est absolument nécessaire de faire une évaluation objective et voir comment il faut faire face au phénomène du terrorisme qui se manifeste dans plusieurs régions dans le continent africain. C'est une menace à la paix internationale. Il faut que les systèmes des Nations Unies, dont nous sommes partis, puissent assumer ses responsabilités. Cela n'exclut pas la responsabilité des Africains et nous-mêmes. Il est bien vrai que le phénomène au départ n'était pas endogène, mais maintenant, ils recrutent sur place. Ce sont des jeunes Africains qui sont recrutés. Alors, ça rappelle à la question de la gouvernance, la question de la manière dont ces États sont gérés. Et donc, c'est un problème plus complexe pour lequel il faut prendre les dispositions nécessaires pour éviter que des États ne soient sous la coupe de groupes extrémistes ou mafieux. Et ça, c'est l'un des défis majeurs aujourd'hui du continent dans ces États pris individuellement et collectivement. Si on veut faire prévaloir des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains, il faut s'en donner les moyens. Et c'est là dès le départ. Merci.
Chairperson, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. When I listen to your narration of all these huge challenges that Africa is facing, and our hopeful exit point is 2063, it looks totally impossible. Do you sometimes feel like you just want to go back to N'Djamena and rest when all this is overwhelming?
Écoutez, on ne peut pas démissionner. On ne peut pas fuir les difficultés. Au contraire. Au contraire. You cannot give up. You should do what is possible to be able to deal with this kind of challenges. It is our responsibility.
I'll let her continue. Okay. Let's come back to our two questions, please. It would help if you only restrict yourself to just one question, keep it short, so that we can have as many. I think we had, number 3 was just over here.
Thank you very much, moderator. Once again, I'm Major General George Gumba, the Commandant of the Senior Command and Staff College, Chimaka, Uganda. I do wholly subscribe to the submissions of the distinguished panelists. But then, with due humility, I'm irresistibly uncomfortable with the topic. Foreign interference. Had I had a hand in the process of formulating the topic, I would probably have settled for something like this: external influence and exploitation or exploration, even as far as defilement of Africa. Because if I may pick it from the submission earlier on by the Honorable Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Rwanda, foreign could be subjective or even relative. Why do I opine so? The legendary white man or woman, whatever gender he or she may have been, who allegedly came with the Bible in hand, was, as far as I recall, invited by our forefathers or foremothers, at least for Uganda. John Huntington Speke, James Grant, Sir Samuel Baker may not have been necessarily missionaries. They were explorers. They were expeditionists. These were military guys at much lower ranks of captain, lieutenant, at most colonel. And everyone in this congregation will agree that at that level, one's blood is hot. One's blood drives one to move as far as he or she can in order to find out. When they finally linked up with our leaders, traditional leaders of the time, as I said earlier, at least for Uganda, those leaders requested for the missionaries in writing. Maybe they were coached, because I doubt whether they knew how to write or read by then, but maybe the explorers coached them in drafting the invitation letters, and the poor guys responded, and they came. Remember, the Arabs had been here much earlier than even the Christian missionaries, at least in the East African region. And the Arabs, the last time I peeped into a mosque, Muslims don't pray with their eyes closed, unless if I peeped into a quack one. So, we may not be really fair in as much as there are positives and negatives. The only way which I would suggest, in a bid to balance, to stabilize the boat, is two ways. One, let us speak and write on the positives of the perceived intruders, perceived interveners, perceived whatever. Two, let us fiercely resist the negatives of them. I do humbly submit.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Moderator, sir, I am Major Sande Felicie from Rwanda Defense Force. I am a student. African governments and the regional organization have recognized the detrimental effects of foreign interferences, and they have taken steps to address them. Efforts including strengthening regional cooperation mechanism, promoting good governance, and advocating for fair trade and investment practices. However, countering enduring foreign interferences remain a complex. Ongoing challenges. What are some specific strategies or initiatives should be taken by African governments and the regional bodies to promote good governance and advocate for fair trade and investment practices as part of their efforts to counter enduring foreign interferences. I wish to direct my question to Professor Lumumba, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm also on the lookout, especially for students, please. I can take one more, please, just here in front. And yeah.
Thank you very much. I am KK, I'm a retired military officer. I wanted to ask Professor Lumumba to comment.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. There was someone behind you, but we'll come back to you. Sorry about that. So that we don't have interference with the microphones. Yes, please.
Je suis le général de brigade Kabissa de Missier, chef du département des opérations de paix à la force en attente de l'Afrique orientale. Au nom de l'ISF, je voudrais d'abord remercier la force de défense du Rwanda pour avoir pensé à notre organisation pour participer à ce symposium. Ma question se dirige directement vers le président de la Commission de l'Union africaine. Monsieur le Président de la Commission de l'Union africaine, permettez-moi, comme nous sommes en face des officiers stagiaires, de penser autrement au concept de l'Union africaine. L'Union africaine a un concept cher ou un slogan ou une devise qui parle de solutions africaines aux problèmes africains. Au regard des interventions de différents conférenciers, vous avez la même approche sur les conséquences exogènes et endogènes sur le continent africain, sur le plan sécuritaire, particulièrement les conséquences négatives. Donc, pour dire que l'insécurité en Afrique, c'est une responsabilité partagée, la responsabilité, bien sûr, des Africains, mais aussi la responsabilité des acteurs étrangers. Et nonobstant, l'Union africaine, en parlant de solutions africaines aux problèmes africains, je crois que l'Union africaine met de côté la part des acteurs extérieurs dans l'insécurité en Afrique. Et quand on s'accuse de ne pas pouvoir financer le coût de la sécurité en Afrique, je crois qu'on oublie la responsabilité des acteurs extérieurs dans l'insécurité ou dans la déstabilisation de l'Afrique. Et ici, vous savez que les pays africains, en contribuant au budget de sécurité de l'Union africaine, ils tirent leur contribution des impôts des contribuables africains. Et si on s'approprie des problèmes qu'on n'a pas causés, est-ce que c'est normal que l'Afrique trouve des solutions aux problèmes qui n'a pas à lui seul causé? Est-ce que ce n'est pas injuste de chercher des solutions africaines aux problèmes qui ne sont pas seulement africains? Je vous donne un petit exemple. Prenons la côte somalienne. C'est une côte de plus de 3300 ligne côtière de plus de 3300 km. Et si on voit les bateaux qui circulent dans l'océan Indien, est-ce que ce sont les Africains qui bénéficient de cet océan Indien quand il est sécurisé? Il y a beaucoup de pays qui bénéficient de la sécurité au niveau de l'océan Indien. Et qu'est-ce qu'elle leur part au niveau de la sécurité en Afrique? Merci.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question, please. Yes, just in front. And I'll come back for another one.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai une préoccupation à adresser à Monsieur le Président de la Commission. J'aimerais avoir la permission du ministre Biruta pour le faire rien qu'en tant qu'ambassadeur du Congo, mais pas doyen du corps diplomatique. Monsieur le Président, il y a...
Yes.
un intervenant qui a insisté sur l'application des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains. J'aimerais vous poser la question de savoir, Monsieur le Président, quels sont les résultats du mécanisme africain d'évaluation par les pairs aujourd'hui. Un autre volet de la même préoccupation, on a dit ici que l'Afrique doit aussi apprendre des autres, oui, mais sauf que ces savoirs, quand nous les ramenons dans le continent, ces savoirs sont rendus dans les langues des autres, dans les langues étrangères. Prenons simplement le cas du signal Internet, par exemple. Et si nous le conduisons jusqu'au fin fond de nos villages, mais si toutes les inscriptions, le mode d'emploi, s'il est dans les langues des autres, comment les populations paysannes peuvent accéder à cet instrument aujourd'hui déterminant pour la vie de tous les jours? Et aussi sur le même registre, nous avons tout suivi il n'y a pas longtemps que le Swahili est désormais la langue de travail de l'Union africaine. Est-ce qu'elle est en dormance ou elle est active au niveau de Addis? Elle participe aux travaux quotidiens des différentes commissions au niveau de l'Union africaine. Et dernière question, Monsieur le Président, à quand l'inscription d'une langue commune africaine dans les programmes scolaires au niveau du continent? Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Let's take those ones first. I'll start with you, Prof. There was one for you.
Let me, the general from Uganda, let me, in my view, correct history. Correct history because the Uganda he's talking about did not exist at the time of exploration. And it is not true that what he said happened. I know, for example, that Kabarega of the Bunyoro Kitara Empire resisted the British and was exiled. It is also true that the British approach to colonization was divide and rule. So what they did was to divide and plant ethnic animosity and entered into pacts with the Buganda kingdom, other kingdoms. In Kenya, they did so with the Maasai and other kingdoms. So it was a strategy. So the purported invitation was not an invitation, but people were led by their nose. People were led by their nose to believe that something good was going to happen to them. And I would urge the good general to read a book by Adekeye Adebajo, The Curse of Berlin, Africa After the Cold War. He speaks to these things in a very proper way. And in my view, that book is useful for all of us who are here. Now, to the question that I've been asked, that is, what can Africa do, particularly with foreign interference? Let us understand that the international economic architecture, as I see it, is one in which Africa did not participate, does not participate in a meaningful way. Take, for example, the Bretton Woods institution that we know about, the World Bank and the IMF. Created in 1944 in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, British economists and American economists immediately after the World War II to target the reparation of Europe through the Marshall Plan. We are grafted into it, and then we become beholden to them. So that when you hear IMF is in your country, you ought to be very worried, because the prescriptions is one size fits all. And if you doubt me, you will remember the prescriptions of the IMF during the structural adjustment in 1980s. Not a single country came out of it in a proper shape. We are not involved in that architecture. Remember also the WTO. The very first meeting of the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco had a component of the WTO. The WTO, as we know it today, is also constructed in a manner that does not benefit us. The idea is that Africa continues to remain a producer of primary goods, and we continue to consume goods that have value addition. How then has Africa tried to react to this? There have been several initiatives. The very early initiatives were not even constructed by Africa. If you remember the African Pacific, Caribbean Pacific, the Lomé Convention, and the Cotonou Declaration, these were initiatives which were influenced from outside. It is after the failure of the Lomé Convention that Africa now said, we want to have our own, hence the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, because Africa recognized trade within Europe is at almost 60%. Trade within North America is at anything 57%. Trade within Asia is at 50%. Trade within Latin America is at 40%. Trade within Africa, 15%. But the Lagos Plan of Action did not realize the dreams that we set for ourselves. So Africa has always identified the solution to our problems. In fact, and the president of the commission, or the chairman commission, will agree with me, if you listen to Kwame Nkrumah when he spoke on 24th day of May, 1963, he said, the only way in which we are going to ensure that we survive in this hostile world is to have one government. Perhaps some said he was naive, he was too idealistic, but he could see it. He could see that the smaller we are, the weaker we are in all aspects. He said, even one army, even one foreign policy, he said. And people thought he was naive. In 2013, when we came up with Africa Agenda 2063, and I invite you to read the letter written by Nkosazana and Dlamini Zuma, from whom the president took over. She is apologizing to Kwame Nkrumah. She's saying, we wish we listened to you. So what are we doing as Africa in terms of trying to deal with this foreign interference? Having recognized these, first of all, under the REX, the East African Community, you remember there was the Committee of Fast Tracking of the East African Community and East African Confederation. The first president of East Africa ought to have been sworn in 2010. It did not happen. As I'm talking to you, there is now a body that is moving around trying to create a constitution for the East African Confederacy, which is a realization that if we want to interfere, if we want to stop foreign interference and we want to engage constructively, we must have a big market, and that market will be the East African market. Hence, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Somalis are coming in, and I'm told the Ethiopians are also contemplating. And not only in East Africa, in ECOWAS, there was even an attempt to create a currency called the ECO, which was torpedoed, as you know, by the French. And in SADC, these are ways and means of immunizing ourselves against the machinations of not only Europe, but China. China is increasingly coming into the continent. Russia is increasingly coming into the continent. Turkey is increasingly coming into the continent. Qatar is increasingly coming into the continent. The Emiratis are coming into the continent. So we are seeing all these things happening. But beyond the REX, there is also the African Union. If you read Africa Agenda 2063 and the 7 aspirations, they are designed specifically to ensure that we form a bulwark against these foreign interference. And let me correct myself if I was misunderstood. They are small nations. Let's not delude ourselves. The theory of sovereignty of nations is a fiction. Right now, we will have meeting of the G7. Why? Because they are bigger economies and we are not there. Then we will have the G20, which are slightly bigger. Then they are the smaller nations, and they met recently in Brussels. So we must distinguish the fiction of equality of nations and the reality of nations. And when, therefore, we want to negotiate at the continent of Africa, we are saying the bigger we are, the better we are. So efforts are there. And as I conclude, I'm saying, if we look at Agenda 2063 and we look at Africa Continental Free Trade Area to eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers, to allow for the free movement of persons, then we would be in a better position to engage. And I'll give this example. Look at East Africa. We said that we did not want second-hand clothing. Rwanda accepted. Then Uganda and Tanzania were persuaded by the United States of America, and we dropped out. This is what divide and rule is all about. So these things that we are talking about, they are not going to be realized in your lifetime. These are intergenerational battles. And our duty, as Nyerere said on the 6th day of March 1997, this generation has a duty to carry the torch. And the worst mistake that we can make is to lose hope and to despair. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof, thank you. Chairperson, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Solution africaine aux problèmes africains. Je crois qu'il faut aller du postulat suivant. Quoique nous vivons dans un monde inégal, injuste, mais nous appartenons, nous aussi en tant que continent, à cette communauté internationale. Et donc, il faut chercher à concilier des concepts comme l'indépendance, la souveraineté, non-ingérence, non-indifférence, sécurité collective, valeurs partagées. Enfin, c'est un tout. Il ne faut pas être dans une position juste de deux côtés. Il y a les bons et les mauvais d'un côté et les autres. Quand on parle des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains, cela n'exclut pas forcément les autres partenaires. Les États africains font plus du quart des membres des Nations Unies, par exemple. Et donc, ce concept va sur le postulat qu'il faut prioriser, parce que chaque société, chaque groupe humain a des valeurs et il a sa manière de régler un certain nombre de problèmes. Je prends l'exemple de la justice transitionnelle. Prenons l'exemple du Rwanda, un pays qui a connu un génocide. Malgré les ingérences extérieures, c'est comme si personne ne voyait, alors que c'était au vu au-dessus de tout le monde. En 100 jours, 1 million de personnes ont été assassinées. Ça également, c'est une responsabilité de la communauté internationale. Mais pour régler le problème, par exemple, la justice transitionnelle, les gachacha, par exemple, dans ce pays, ça, c'est une approche typiquement africaine, typiquement rwandaise, pour régler un problème qui s'est posé dans une société donnée. Donc, quand on dit solution africaine aux problèmes africains, cela n'exclut pas forcément les partenaires. La responsabilité partagée, j'ai évoqué la question en matière de financement. Vous savez que selon la Charte des Nations Unies, c'est le Conseil de sécurité qui est en charge du maintien de la paix et de la sécurité dans le monde. Puisqu'on a qualifié le terrorisme et l'extrémisme violent comme une menace à la paix et à la sécurité, nous sommes fondés juridiquement à demander à cette institution, puisque le phénomène se développe dans nos pays, de financer les opérations pour mettre un terme à ces phénomènes. Vous l'aurez remarqué, des coalitions internationales ont été formées en Irak, en Syrie, avec des centaines de milliers d'hommes et des milliards qui ont été dépensés pour arrêter le terrorisme, l'État islamique, Al-Qaïda et autres. Nous avons demandé à ce que ces coalitions-là puissent se former également pour extraire ces phénomènes du continent africain. Ce qui n'a pas été fait. Ce qui n'a pas été fait. Alors, c'est pour cela que j'ai dit, ces phénomènes-là, c'est une question. Nous avons notre responsabilité, parce que le problème se pose chez nous. Même si les autres n'interviennent pas, nous sommes obligés de faire face avec les moyens dont nous disposons. Donc, il y a une responsabilité collective. Donc, il n'y a pas forcément, quand on dit solution africaine aux problèmes africains, une exclusion des partenaires, et moins encore du système des Nations Unies dont nous sommes partis nous-mêmes. La responsabilité, donc, elle est d'abord africaine. Pour ce qui concerne les côtes somaliennes, les phénomènes de la piraterie, je crois que la réponse qui a été apportée a été une réponse internationale. Les Européens, les Américains, tout le monde est intervenu pour faire face au phénomène. Mais quoi qu'on dise, si un phénomène, même s'il est exogène, mais s'il se manifeste sur votre territoire, je crois que la responsabilité première, le réflexe même, je dirais, c'est d'y faire face, parce que cela se passe dans votre pays. Les seconds intervenants sur la question du MAEP, mécanisme africain de l'évaluation par les pairs, c'est un mécanisme qui a été conçu et qui était facultatif. Aujourd'hui, 36 États africains ont accepté de rentrer dans ce mécanisme, dont les résultats sont assez mitigés, il faut le reconnaître. Mais récemment, il y a 3 ans, nous avons institué que le MAEP doit annuellement faire un rapport sur la gouvernance dans le continent africain. Je crois que c'est une avancée significative. Donc, il est de la responsabilité des attributions de ces mécanismes d'établir chaque année un rapport global sur le continent pour voir où nous en sommes pour ce qui concerne la gouvernance, qui est l'un des défis majeurs dans ce continent. La question de l'utilisation des langues, c'est vrai, c'est très important. Nous avons comme langue de travail l'anglais, le français, l'arabe, le portugais. Récemment, nous avons ajouté l'espagnol. Le swahili également est une langue de travail et on l'utilise. Techniquement, nous sommes en train de travailler pour pouvoir recruter des interprètes et autres. Ce sont des questions pratiques, mais ceci a été accepté par les États membres. La question de la promotion des langues nationales, je crois que ça fait partie de la politique de nos États membres, y compris de l'Union africaine. Aujourd'hui, certains linguistes nous conseillent de mettre l'accent sur les langues qui dépassent des États, comme le Swahili, comme le Hausa, comme le Lingala, entre autres langues qui couvrent un espace important, englobant parfois plusieurs États membres. Donc la promotion des langues africaines, des langues nationales africaines, est un objectif important, ne serait-ce que pour pouvoir alphabétiser, vulgariser un certain nombre de choses. Nous avons besoin de faire la promotion des langues africaines. Voilà globalement le problème qui se pose. Donc il n'y a pas forcément dichotomie entre le fait qu'on privilégie des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains et l'implication des partenaires externes ou une organisation continentale comme les Nations Unies, dont, ce que je disais, nous constituons un peu plus même du quart des membres. Voilà, merci.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me come back I want to prioritize our students, please. They've been very quiet, if you may. There
was one question from a student which was not...
Oh, really? Did I miss one?
On regional integration and specific measures.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah.
Regional integration.
Mr. Do you want to have a go?
I thought we answered it a little about regional integration.
Yeah.
Or specific towards regional integration. I think that there is a sense in which there's directs the regional organizations. East Africa is the one that I think is closest to integration. Because as I said at the very outset, we had the East African Community, which, as you know, died in 1970, as was revived again in 1999. And the original members, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, have subsequently, after the 1999 treaty, Rwanda are now members, Burundi are members, South Sudan is a member, and recently we admitted the Democratic Republic of Congo. The whole idea was to create a federation. And in the year 2004, the then heads of state did appoint a committee for fast tracking. And a report was given talking about how we are going to have a common currency, a common tariff, and common services. And indeed, some of the things are already happening. It is only in the area of common currency, which we thought we would have in 2024. I don't think we will. And then, of course, the idea of having a political federation, as I've already said, there is a committee going round. And the idea of the federation is that we make sure that there is free movement of persons, and certain countries are ahead. Rwanda, for example, I think is ahead of the region in terms of offering opportunities for employment and permits. There are certain countries like Burundi which are still lagging behind, but the whole idea is that ultimately we'll have a confederation, and that confederation will be a confederation where we will have a president. In fact, under the fast-tracking document, all ministers in charge of East African integration ought to have moved and ought to have been operating from Arusha in Dar es Salaam by the year 2010. So that is moving apace. In SADC region, where we thought South Africa would be the anchor, I don't think that that is beyond the trade issue. The political question is one that has not come out as strongly as it should. And that is for a number of reasons. First of all, South Africa reeling from apartheid, and then Mozambique and Angola there with the Portuguese tradition. But you can see that trade is one of the major drivers. In ECOWAS, we also know that Nigeria is the anchor in that regard. They were moving towards a monetary policy. And in fact, there is an ECOWAS passport in the same way that there is an East African passport. So in a nutshell, Central Africa is problematic. The Maghreb is problematic. And that is something that we must talk, because in the early days, and you just give me a little latitude on this, Joe. In the early days, in the 1960s, we had clear Pan-Africanists in the Maghreb. King Hassan of Morocco hosted certain meetings in Casablanca, Morocco, Mokhtar al-Dada in Mauritania, Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, Hamid Ben Bella in Algeria, and Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. But in the recent past, we now have individuals who are undecided as to whether they want to be part of the African continent or they want to be part of the Arab. So the Maghreb is a little problematic, and Morocco, you know, at one time even left the African Union. So in a nutshell, the drive, the hunger is there, and the push is there. So personally, I'm not very worried. I think that what we ought to do is to plant this seed so that the fire keeps burning, because it is through this regional integration that we ultimately will have an African Union. And easier said than done. Perhaps we are too optimistic, but is optimism not the mother's milk of progress?
Prof, thank you. Minister, then I come to you, sir.
I just wanted to add on what Professor Lumumba said. At the continental level, there are specific measures which are provided for in Agenda 2063, what we used to call flagship projects in various sectors: infrastructure, railway networks, and airports, and internet infrastructure. There is one of these projects is the African Continental Free Trade Area, the African Passport, African University. There is a list of flagship projects, and those are specific measures which need to be implemented just to let us achieve, to make us achieve the continental integration, in addition to the regional integration, which has just been talked about.
Okay, come to you, Chairperson.
J'ajouterais tout simplement pour rappeler que l'OUA, en 1991, a adopté le traité d'Abuja, qui met en place la communauté économique africaine. C'est sur cette base qu'ont été érigées les communautés économiques régionales. SADC, ECOWAS, ECAS, Eastern African Community, IGAD, UMA, Union du Maghreb arabe. Toutes ces communautés économiques régionales ont été mises en place et dans la réforme, appelée réforme Kagame, à partir de 2017, on a maintenant le deuxième sommet annuel a été transformé en un sommet de coordination. Donc chaque année au mois de juillet, se tient un sommet qui réunit le bureau de la conférence, les chefs d'État et les chefs exécutifs des différentes communautés économiques régionales, la Commission et le NEPAD pour un sommet généralement au mois de juillet pour faire le point sur les questions d'intégration, les questions de développement économique et social. En matière de gouvernance, parce que l'étudiant a posé également, il y a une stratégie africaine de bonne gouvernance qui a été mise en place, mais j'avoue que c'est le maillon le plus faible dans le continent. Quand on voit des coups d'État militaires, notamment en Afrique de l'Ouest, la CEDEAO était prise comme modèle, un modèle de démocratie, d'élections libres, et il y a des valeurs partagées qui ont été adoptées par l'Union africaine, y compris dans l'agenda 2063, que nous optons pour la démocratie élective. Malheureusement, nous constatons un recul dans un certain nombre de pays où des coups d'État militaires sont advenus, où des changements non constitutionnels du gouvernement ont été constatés, et il faut naturellement revenir parce que sans la bonne gouvernance, je crois que tout le projet africain ne pourra jamais s'exécuter. Ça, c'est une exigence. Puisqu'on l'a adopté, il faut être ferme, il faut que les responsables, les leaders soient comptables devant les populations qui les ont élus. Et justement, c'est là où se trouve le nœud et peut-être la solution du problème. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chairperson. Before I come back to questions, a quick comment from Brian, and then we can come back for more questions.
In fact, I'm glad. I think I already said to the minister that myself and a couple of lawyers, Prof, we would like to discuss one. There is a specific mechanism at Malabo. The African region, African Union, was the first region in the world to define a crime of unconstitutional change of government. That included all the usual things that we talked about, but also questions such as tinkering with constitutions and etc. However, I think as the reforms have gone along, attention to the human rights architecture has not been as thorough. And obviously we have to be careful because it's also the architecture that's likely to be used for all sorts of interference and etc. But the investment and thinking through the question of the African Court of Justice, the Court of Human Rights, and the Commission is central. I, in earlier conversations, had suggested when the ambassadors met that it is absolutely imperative to upgrade the Africa governance architecture to almost the status that you have the peace and security architecture, in the sense that most of what we had in governance, which was local governance and all the other things from Ezuluini up to now, are treated almost as NGO talk. By the time we get to the peace and security architecture, we are now dealing with a live problem. The preemptive work that's in between addressing member state compliance with the shared values instruments of the African Union. I'm not talking about foreign instruments, instruments that the member states have agreed to, which is the Charter on Values and Principles of the Public Service, Charter and Values of Decentralization and Local Governance, African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. So as I think the minister said, as the chairperson said, the normative frameworks exist. What we need to think through now is how do you make them coherent, number one, how do you sustainably resource them? And I'm not just talking about money. Member states have for many years adopted the approach, and with respect, Minister and Chairperson, they send to the African Union not their best talent, but people they don't know what to do with, or they want to manage out or promote out. And the African Union itself and its employment has never made Pan-Africanism or a Pan-African mindset as the basis of employment. So the orientation in some of the senior employees within the African Union chairperson are quite contrary to the political statements we make. So addressing, I think that's what you wanted to know, is Africa has gone further than most regions. It has the normative frameworks, it has the institutional architecture. We now have to address coherence and making sure our resourcing, both financial, material, and human resourcing, is top-notch. We need our best talent at the African Union because these are the people, from what I am hearing in the audience, our expectation, Minister and Chairperson, is that you will negotiate, that when a country wants to talk to Africa, they can talk to the African Union or they can talk to SADC. But if we're not sending our best people there, then there is a real danger that the technical expertise and support will become fragmented and will revert back to what each individual state wants. And when we go to that, we're easily fragmented. I think for you in the audience, everybody who says African Union is useless and so on and so forth, and who are frustrated with the African Union, just remember what Chinua Achebe said. We are not the children of Africa. We are the parents of Africa, because the Africa that we want is yet to be born. And we are the ones that history has charged with the responsibility to give birth to the Africa we want. So whatever we are frustrated with respect to the African Union, our responsibility is how do we make the normative frameworks and the institutions work, but how do we build the repository of expertise so that the African Union at any given time has access to the best brains, the best technical expertise in any field on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
A brief one. I just wanted to reassure my colleague here that Rwanda is exactly doing what he is recommending. We are choosing the best talent for the African Union, and we are supporting them to deliver on their mandate. And I can also confirm to you that Chad did the same when they proposed the chairperson to lead our union. Thank you.
Vivement que l'appel du frère soit entendu par nos États membres.
Okay, and can I just check, Chairperson, that when member states are not making contributions to the AU, but they do meet the obligations to IMF, World Bank, is that right, or no? I'm just wondering.
J'avoue que ces derniers temps, on a pris un certain nombre de mesures, y compris des sanctions. Suspension, vous ne avez pas le droit de vote. Et donc, le nouveau mécanisme a poussé les États à être plus réguliers dans le paiement de leurs contributions. Le fait est que nous avons opté pour une méthode de prélèvement automatique de 0,2%. Il y a beaucoup de difficultés à le faire appliquer pour certains États. Mais j'avoue qu'avec la prise des dernières décisions, le taux de contribution s'est sensiblement amélioré. Ça, il faut le reconnaître.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, back to the floor. Yes, your hand is right up. I will try to be very democratic. Yeah, that's question one. Oh boy, and my students, we don't see them. Yes, please. You're number two, with a broad smile. Yeah. And question three, let me look on this. So, yes. So 1, 2, 3, and then we'll try and be, if you're very direct to the point and with one question, we can move a lot more quick and get more questions in, please. Sir, over to you.
Sir, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Innocent Gisagara from Rwanda Defense Force and a student. Sir, my question, I begin with a quote. We should stop blame games and focus on our problem solving by Honorable Foreign Minister of Rwanda in recent hours ago. Now, my question is, the instability and violence in Africa has been characterized by rebel groups with logistical support, training, political support, and even strategic support. Who are the actors, and what should be done to stop these destructive interferences and stabilize our continent for future and current development? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Simplice Mlenzi from the RDF, a student. So, my question goes to His Excellency Moussa Faki and Professor Pierre Lumumba. Sir, you earlier mentioned of lack of political will by some countries or heads of states who agree on some decision today and change their mind tomorrow. And to me, this sounds actually to have frustrated or undermined efforts to find solutions facing African Union. An example is the $0.2% earlier mentioned on imports to finance the African Union activities. So as a way of evaluating the reasons for lack of this political will, I request to know if you have ever tried to find out why our leaders or our heads of states have two different languages. And if yes, I request that you shed more light on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the third one?
Thank you very much, Chairperson, Your Excellencies. My name is Lieutenant General Nakibus La Kara. I am not the CDF. I was tasked by the CDF to participate. So don't see CDF and think I am. I am not. Really, just listening to the panelists, the first question really, and this arises from 6 or 7 years ago, I participated at a symposium at the National Defense College headquarters, Nyakinama. And this was localized. It was just the students and a few professors. But today, this symposium has taken a huge leap. And today to see the chairperson, His Excellency Mahamat of the African Union Commission, and the renowned and revered PLO here with us. And the question therefore is, so we thank the RDF and the Republic of Rwanda for really building on this platform of engagement. And the question here would be to the chairperson, to the honorable chairperson, this is not to put you on the spot really. And it is also sad that you are here and there are students here. There should have been probably a different forum. But the Honorable PLO Lumumba would disagree that, you know, let us undress and see our nakedness as it is, really. But you know that some of us are constrained given background. But it's good to hear this fiery, volatile voice from PLO Lumumba and Mr. Kagoro. Would such a discourse as this take place at a high level at the African Union, where we speak to ourselves at that executive level? Would it ever take place in a very honest and having those candid discussions? Mr. Kagoro, I am amazed at what the natives have had to say here. Amazed. And I just didn't know it exists, that natives can say so much. And because, Mr. Kagoro, you yourself, you have enumerated the Africans who are assassinated. And because of the patriotism and the Pan-Africanism they were pursuing, the risks are there. Don't you think the risks are still there? And if the risks are there, if you cannot be isolated, who then will pursue such? Mr. Kagoro, this Pan-Africanism that we all talk about, and the Honorable His Excellency Mahamat also, this Pan-Africanism has really, PLO Lumumba agrees, this Pan-Africanism, this, fervor for it, it's gone down. It's gone down. How can we possibly, rekindle it? Rekindle it. Because Mr. Kagoro, you alluded to the fact that even our own employers rob from ourselves and take to this other country, which is number one in terms of incorruptibility. And how can we really get this? And don't forget that, we have all these courts, we have all these agents, all these influencers.
Allow us time to answer this as well, sir. We're running out of time, so if you can...
I agree, just to putting perspective into this. But you have all these players. It's not just the external actor alone. It is these local, agents who are part of the problem. How do you deal with those? Now, a solution has been given. Resistance, resist. But Honorable Minister Biruta, now if this foreign actor chooses divide and rule, you resist, and the other one doesn't resist, how possibly can we, bring all these 54 states, how can we galvanize them to resist at the same level so that this, we can fight off this foreign interference? Finally, this economic fragility, Mr. Kagoro, we have all the natural resources, we are crying foul, there is no funding to the African Union. Where then would the resources come up? Thank you very much. I submit.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with you, Prof. I think there was quite some issues to, yes.
Just two things. Let me start with what the good general said about rekindling the Pan-African spirit. When we were students, we were taught history of Pan-African movements, so the education system actually told us about Africa. I now know in many African countries where history is not taught. So when you stop teaching history, then you begin to see that we do not even know what is happening. And I think that one of the things that we must do is to look at our curriculum in our respective institutions of higher learning. It is only in that way that we'll begin to plant the seed of Pan-Africanism, and it is only in that way that we will educate our young people. Indeed, I dare say that if Africa Agenda 2063 and all these initiatives are going to gain traction, it is the younger generation that must, in a manner of speaking, be indoctrinated. And I'm using the word indoctrinated very, very deliberately, so that they can identify with this struggle for Pan-Africanism. And I think that that is very important going forward, so that forums such as this, and you remember earlier, and then I stopped when I said that I hope the meeting on the next week in the Pan-African, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, will not be just pro forma. It will be a meeting at which the heads of states and the Council of Ministers raise critical issues with a clear plan of action, so that the Secretariat has things to cascade to the people for purposes of consumption, so that we can begin to see milestones as we move towards fulfilling the Pan-African dream. I want to stop there so that others may also enrich the debate. Thank you.
Yes, over to you. Yeah.
On the question of honorable groups which are present on our continent in various regions, yes, it is the reality. And we need to deal with them. We need, first of all, to have measures to prevent those rebel groups to exist. And those measures are related to good governance we need to have in our countries, socio-economic integration, inclusion. And we need to just not make sure you don't have those conditions which will make easy for foreign powers or for various groups to recruit and to recruit our people and organize them into rebel groups. So governance, socio-economic inclusion is key, but we need also to build strong states which can deal with any security threat, and that is very important. Beyond that, you have regional mechanisms to deal with those kind of situations, but once again, the responsibility of all our states to deliver services to their people, to make sure that they participate in the government, that they give their opinion, that their grievances are addressed. It is key for us not to create the ground for rebel groups or any other destabilizing factors to prevail. So we need to do that, and we need also to identify those problems or various actors, and just know that there will always be temptation from some people, some groups, to build on the weaknesses of our state to achieve their own interests. So that is where I'm saying strong states, having strong states is important, to have capacity to defend the sovereignty of our state. It is important, but we need to build on strong governance systems. We need to have in our countries. So on the issue of Rwanda doing some things and resisting while others don't, I think we need to be principled. When we think that something is good for our country, for our people, we just need to have the courage to do it, and eventually others will see that it is good, and they will join. It is like the Agenda 2063 we were talking about. Let me take the example of the free movement of people. When Rwanda decided to just allow all African citizens, all citizens of the world actually, to be able to come to our country without applying for a visa and get it for free on arrival for African citizens, for citizens of the Commonwealth and the Organization of the Francophonie. We could not wait for everybody to do that, but we did it, and it worked. We have not seen any particular problem in relation to our security, in relation to illegal migration or whatever. And we believe that other countries could follow. And we are actually engaging other countries to do the same for our citizens on the basis of reciprocity. And we should also just be patient and understand that not everybody is going to move at the same pace the same day. Let's do the right things now and accept to be pioneers on some of these good policies, and eventually others will join in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there was one for the chairperson.
Merci. Je crois que le ministre a répondu sur les questions des rébellions. Il y a une décision de l'Union africaine en 2009 pour condamner les rébellions armées. Mais vous savez, parfois, ceci est lié à la question de la gouvernance dans les États. Donc, l'un dans l'autre, je ne pense pas que le choix des rébellions armées soit la solution au problème de gouvernance, Mais il y a des efforts à faire parce que le tout réside dans la manière dont le pays est géré. La question de manque de volonté politique, c'est un exercice. Je disais qu'en 2017, il a été décidé de réformer l'Union africaine. Une réforme institutionnelle sur le financement et sur l'ensemble des structures. Cette réforme continue. D'ailleurs, dans 3 semaines, on aura une retraite ici à Kigali, auprès du président Kagame, pour faire l'évaluation de l'ensemble du processus de réforme institutionnelle de l'Union africaine. Par exemple, avant 2017, la commission de l'Union africaine était composée de 10 personnes. Maintenant, on a réduit à 8. La région dont le président et les vice-présidents sont issus n'ont pas d'autres commissaires. Et les 3 autres régions ont chacun 2 commissaires, un homme et une femme, par exemple. Ça fait partie des réformes qui ont été décidées en 2017. Et nous sommes en train de faire un travail sur l'ensemble des organes et institutions pour faire les points, y compris sur la question du financement et la règle qui a été établie, qui n'est pas totalement appliquée, celle de retenir 0,2% sur les importations. Comme vous le savez, comme toute réforme, naturellement, il y a de la réticence, il y a même de la résistance, mais c'est un processus. Ce n'est pas la première fois que l'Union africaine a essayé de faire des réformes. Il faut maintenir ce processus pour, à terme, arriver à une institution opérationnelle et, je l'espère, plus efficace. La question du panafricanisme revient très souvent. Je le disais, quand on constate dans les 60 ans, on sent un déclin. Un déclin. Et ça, c'est quelque chose de très inquiétant. L'un des reproches qui a été fait à l'Union africaine, c'est qu'elle est très loin des citoyens. Et donc, dans les décisions de 2017 sur la réforme, on dit qu'il faut rapprocher l'Union africaine des citoyens africains. Le mécanisme, c'est les États membres, les communautés économiques régionales. C'est pour cela que maintenant, le mécanisme commence des États membres, il vient au niveau régional et au niveau continental pour travailler et essayer d'impliquer davantage. À mon avis, le panafricanisme d'aujourd'hui, pour moi, c'est égal à la bonne gouvernance. Parce que vraiment, pour convaincre les citoyens, c'est par l'action qu'il faut les convaincre. Si l'État est bien géré, si les textes sont respectés, si la transparence, la accountability, le respect des textes, le respect des décisions, l'égalité et la justice sont constatés par les citoyens, leur adhésion va être certainement plus grande. Il y a un défi majeur, et comme quelqu'un l'a dit, nous avons les instruments, nous avons les textes. Il s'agit maintenant de les mettre en œuvre. Il s'agit de les mettre en œuvre pour prouver d'abord aux citoyens et même aux Africains qui sont majoritairement jeunes et qui sont exigeants. Ils ne peuvent plus se nourrir juste d'une phraséologie ou des slogans. Ils veulent concrètement travailler, ils veulent être traités de manière égale, ils ont besoin qu'on tienne compte de leurs attentes, et je crois que c'est le défi majeur. Donc, plus les leaders se montreront capables de montrer un leadership en matière de gouvernance, mieux ils seront acceptés et mieux le continent se portera. Merci.
Thank you very much. I think, Brian, there was a comment as well from you.
My father told me a story of a man who was given a job as a janitor at the school. His job was to lock the gate every day at 6 p.m. And then some people in the neighborhood came and informally redistributed the fence. Some of you would say stole the fence of the school. This man faithfully locked the gate, but the fence had been stolen. And the purpose of locking the gate was to ensure safety. If the fence is stolen, put back the fence. So let me explain what this. A young Zimbabwean businessman called Busisa Moyo characterized the problem of Africa. He said, "We are not broke, we are broken." Right? And there is a difference. It's a very wealthy continent in terms of its human resource. When the United States decided to appoint a head for PEPFAR, they took away from my senior here the chairperson of the African Union, he's head of Africa CDC. There are Africans strategically, or black persons strategically heading very strategic institutions in the global north. Why am I saying this? My elder Ashraf asked me about narrative. There are 5 modes of narrative. First mode is action. That's what I think the chairperson of the African Union is saying, that people will not believe what we say until they see us act according to our beliefs. Pan-Africanism is not a theory. It's the lived solidarity that made the Ethiopians give Nelson Mandela a passport, that made Senegalese civil servants contribute $1 each every month for the liberation of South Africa, that made Zambia take care of us as Zimbabweans and South Africans as we fought for our liberation, that made Uganda take care of the comrades that now run this country. If Pan-Africanism has no active solidarity action, no active affirmative action, the words are meaningless, because even the devil can quote scripture. The second is dialogic. We have for too long used authority to govern our people and not dialogue. And in this respect, I must commend my colleagues and comrades here in Rwanda, because they are able to hold leadership meetings where citizens talk to leaders. I am hoping the African Union chairperson and the African Union Commission chairperson can actually convene with ECOSOC a conference each year of the citizens, not just NGO, a conference of the citizens drawn from the continent, and talk, because often we only get to talk to our leaders in conferences in the United States and in Europe, and thought. There is no Pan-Africanism without doing what Mishera Mugo said, create liberated zones of Pan-Africanist thought. When we think, it's our European theorists who are thinking. When we speak, it's our American teachers who are speaking. It is okay to have gone to America to learn. It is okay to have gone to Asia to learn. But what is the influence of African intellectuals and thought on what the African Union does, on what our governments do, on what our civil society does? Number 3, we need to describe oppression. I'm sorry, I hear this a lot when I come to Rwanda. You have to hear me, I'm Rwandese, so you cannot do anything about me. I have immunity here. You people like to say, let's forget, let's not blame anyone. Please, stop that nonsense. When the Holocaust happened against the Jews, it was 1940s, 45. Not a single African country other than Ethiopia and those who had not been colonized was free. The first African country got independent 1957. There is not a single Jewish person who will allow you to forget the Holocaust. And in fact, there are crimes, not just in Israel, across the world against denial of the Holocaust. US foreign policy, Israeli foreign policy is very key. It's a central issue. Africans, for some reason, must forget something that happened 50 years ago, if you are Zimbabwe 80 years ago. Listen, we must always remind our friends from Europe and elsewhere that slavery was a crime against humanity, as is colonialism and neo-colonialism. That killing Sankara in 1984 because you are opposed to communism and plunging his country into chaos that you are now trying to solve as a problem of poor governance is a shared responsibility. So we will take responsibility for our nakedness. But for goodness sake, a naked emperor cannot lecture us about how to be clothed. And I'll tell you the contradictions. When Europeans first came here, if you come to the south of the continent, ladies did not wear long skirts, and they did not cover their top. Then they said, no, that's indecent. So we covered everything, including the head. And then the Europeans have decided to go nude now. Now the dress code in Europe is pre-colonial Africa. And then when our kids try and dress up that way, we say it's an African. We are confused around ownership. So lastly, Chairperson, the taboos. You see, Chairperson, we need to talk about global anti-black racism, the treatment of African migrant laborers in the Middle East, in the Arab world, and in the Asian world, and in Europe, is a matter for the African Union to constantly pronounce itself on. And I'm glad, Chairperson, you issued a statement on George Floyd, but I'm waiting for the African Union resolution from last January on reparations. There was a formal policy of the United States government in 2015 for reparations by companies behind the Holocaust. There needs to be, the conversation on reparations is not to be settled by African political elites, right? Today, Zimbabwe is paying back white commercial farmers reparations. But when you talk about any reparations, it's like the black body is not worth repair. What we must do is endure, be resilient, go forward, don't look back, trudge on. But today with the scramble of Africa that PLO was talking about, they will interfere here whether we put in place the right policies or we put in place the good governance. Why? They need the lithium. And if your right policy is not consistent with their green energy transition that they control, they will take you out and they will cause instability. We cannot do it as single countries. We are not uniting because it's the good thing to do. We are not uniting because it's the principled thing to do. If we don't unite, we will perish. If each one of our small countries, as economically unviable as we are, rush in order to prove distinctiveness, I'll tell you what will happen. We will be so fragmented intellectually, politically. Our institutions will have no meaning. Let me end with something more positive. I think Pan-Africanism flavor is alive today. You adults, you only listen when you have had a few glasses of wine to Afrobeat. And of course, you don't like this thing. They're always singing about body parts and so on and so forth. I want to suggest to you, one of the most revolutionary things that the African Union, under the leadership of the chairperson here, has done is to talk about arts, culture, and heritage, not as entertainment, not as add-on, but as part of imagining the future economy, is to talk about the digital, not as part of little things you do, but as part of building the economy. All that's left now is how do we defend African art, culture, and heritage, not only in Africa, but globally. How do we make sure it is the mainstream of AFCFTA along with all the other big things we do? And how do we, in the digital economy, make sure we are not consumers of products that are produced elsewhere and not part of the production chain? Okay. If we do that, our Pan-Africanism is economic, our Pan-Africanism is cultural, our Pan-Africanism is intellectual, our Pan-Africanism is also spiritual. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've come to the end. I have just one question for the panel, and they're only allowed one answer. It's either a yes or a no. They have to decide which side they're on. It's a very simple question. We may not be here. Lumumba has told us we're doing this for the generations of Africa to come. Come 2063, do you believe that we will have a United States of Africa with a passport of whatever color that allows me to travel from Jamena to Nairobi freely without any intervention? Do you believe that this can and might be a reality when it comes to 2063? We may not be around, but our descendants will be here. Brian, yes or no? Please don't put any political theory. Thank you. Professor?
Yes.
Sir, Minister.
Is it yes or no? Or?
A yes or a no?
Yes, I believe we can achieve that. Maybe I will add that if we can't change the history, I believe that by adopting the right mindset and the right attitude today, do the right things today, we can have a positive impact on the future of our own countries, our region, and our continent. So I believe it is achievable.
Okay. Chairperson?
Absolument possible.
Okay. Thank you. So I end with this little comment about this young Tanzanian chap who lived somewhere near Dodoma, came from a poor family, was helped through his education by people overseas. It was actually in the UK, and he went to visit those people who were helping him, his sponsors, through his education. And they noticed that when he was speaking to them, he had a very strange way of talking. He was saying, "I've come from Tanzania today," and they were really disturbed. What's wrong with this young man that he's speaking? Until later it was explained to them that he learned English via shortwave radio. So I hope our conversation has been lucid, clear, and free of interference. Thank you so much for your time. And I just want to say thank you to Honorable Biruta, Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Republic of Rwanda, His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat, who is AU Commission Chairperson, to Brian Kagoro, Global Pan-African Movement, PLO Lumumba, from Lumumba and Lumumba Advocates. What the panel didn't know is that I had quietly sent word to our RDF colleagues to put a team together, a small battalion, because I was sensing that we might need intervention in this area. But luckily the fire has been contained and we've all been civil. Thank you very much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, lunch is served.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our distinguished panel and an excellent moderator, Mr. Joseph Warungu, for performing as expected. So next on our agenda is that we are going to have lunch. So the first 3 rows, as we discussed earlier, will use the left exit, and then the rest will use the right. And please wait for the first 3 rows to exit before you all step out. Give it a few minutes, please. Thank you very much. And we'll be back at 1400 hours, as usual. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.